The year was 1715, and across the harbours of England a peculiar quiet had settled over the docks. For 13 long years, the War of the Spanish Succession had raged across Europe and the Americas, filling the coffers of maritime adventurers and legitimizing the brutal art of sea warfare. Now, with the Treaty of Utrecht signed and sealed, that profitable chaos had come to an abrupt end. In the port of Bristol, weathered men gathered in taverns, thick with pipe smoke, and whispered conversations. These were not ordinary sailors, but privateers, men who had held royal commissions to attack enemy shipping, to burn Spanish treasure galleons and French merchantmen in the name of Queen Anne. They had grown accustomed to the weight of cutlass and pistol, to the thrill of boarding parties, and the sweet taste of prize money divided among loyal crews. Thomas Barrow sat in the corner of the Anchor Inn, his calloused hands wrapped around a pewter mug of ale. The commission that had once made him a legal predator of the seas now lay worthless in his sea chest, nothing more than parchment and fading ink. Around him, dozens of men faced the same bitter reality. The war that had made them wealthy had made them obsolete. "What's a man to do now?" muttered James Fife, a gunner whose expertise lay in the precise art of crippling enemy vessels. "Back to hauling cargo for merchants who'll pay us a shilling a month." The question hung in the salt-tinged air, like smoke from a cannon's mouth. These men had tasted freedom on the high seas, had felt the intoxicating power of taking what they wanted by force of arms. The prospect of returning to the mundane world of legitimate commerce felt like a kind of death. In Portsmouth, similar scenes played out in every waterfront establishment. Captain Benjamin Hornigold, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance had earned him considerable wealth during the war, found himself studying the faces of his former crew. They looked to him with the same expectant eyes that had once watched him plot the capture of Spanish prizes. But now there were no Spanish prizes, no French targets, no legitimate enemies to hunt. The transformation from privateer to pirate required no dramatic moment of decision, no grand declaration of war against the civilized world. It was, instead, a gradual recognition that the skills they had learned in service to the Crown could serve them just as well in service to themselves. The Caribbean had always been a place where the line between legal and illegal activity blurred like heat waves rising from sun-baked decks. During the war, English privateers had operated from bases in Jamaica and the Bahamas, striking at Spanish shipping lanes that connected the treasure ports of South America to the metropolitan centers of Seville and Cadiz. They had learned the rhythms of the treasure fleets, the seasonal patterns of trade winds, and the hidden channels between countless islands where a ship could disappear as completely as if it had sailed off the edge of the world. Now, as 1715 drew to a close, many of these former privateers began to drift toward those same Caribbean waters. Some still carried their old commissions, expired documents they could wave at any Royal Navy captain curious enough to investigate their activities. Others had already abandoned such pretenses, recognizing that the age of legal piracy had ended, but the age of profitable illegal piracy was just beginning. The Spanish Empire, victorious in the recent war, had resumed its ancient pattern of extracting wealth from the Americas, silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from the rivers of New Granada, pearls from the beds off Venezuela, all flowed in predictable currents toward the mother country. The Spanish treasure fleets, those heavily laden flotillas that had sailed the same routes for over 2 centuries, represented the most tempting targets in the world for men who had learned to think like predators. In the Bahamas, the settlement of Nassau had grown during the war into a haven for English privateers. The harbour was deep enough for the largest ships, yet shallow enough in places to provide refuge from pursuing vessels of deeper draught. The island of New Providence, on which Nassau sat, was positioned perfectly to control the vital shipping lanes between the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Most importantly, it lay far enough from the centres of British colonial administration to operate with virtual independence. As former privateers began to gather in Nassau, they brought with them not just their ships and weapons, but their knowledge of naval warfare and their understanding of the complex web of Caribbean commerce. They knew which merchants could be trusted to buy stolen goods without asking uncomfortable questions, which officials could be bribed to look the other way, and which islands offered safe harbour when the heat of pursuit grew too intense. The summer of 1715 had been particularly harsh in the Caribbean. Hurricane season brought storms of unusual ferocity, and the Spanish authorities had delayed the departure of their treasure fleet until the weather moderated. By July, 11 ships heavy with the accumulated wealth of a year's mining and trading had assembled in Havana, preparing for the long journey across the Atlantic. The fleet was commanded by Captain General Don Antonio de Echevers y Zubiza, a veteran of many such crossings who understood both the value of his cargo and the dangers that awaited any ship carrying such wealth. The combined value of gold, silver, and precious goods aboard the 11 vessels exceeded 6 million pieces of 8, a sum so vast that it represented a significant portion of the Spanish crown's annual revenue. On July 24, 1715, the fleet departed Havana with fair winds and clear skies. The ships rode heavy in the water, their holds packed with treasure chests, bags of silver coins, and carefully wrapped artifacts of gold and precious stones. Don Antonio felt confident that this crossing would be like dozens of others, routine, profitable, and secure. The former privateers gathering in Nassau watched the Spanish preparations with professional interest. Word of the fleet's departure spread quickly through the network of informants and spies that connected every major port in the Caribbean. In the taverns of Port Royal and the warehouses of Bridgetown, men calculated distances and sailing times, estimating when the treasure ships would pass through the Florida Straits on their way to the open Atlantic. But the Caribbean summer of 1715 had not finished with its surprises. As the Spanish fleet sailed north along the coast of Florida, following the Gulf Stream that would carry them toward Europe, the atmospheric conditions that had created the earlier storms began to reassemble themselves into something far more dangerous. On the morning of July 30th, the weather began to deteriorate. The wind, which had been steady and favourable, grew erratic and vacillant. The sky darkened to the colour of old pewter, and the sea began to build into the long, rolling swells that experienced sailors recognized as the harbinger of a major storm. Don Antonio ordered his ships to close formation, keeping the slower vessels in the center while the faster warships took positions on the flanks. It was a standard procedure for riding out heavy weather, but as the day progressed, it became clear that this was no ordinary storm. The wind reached hurricane force, driving sheets of rain horizontally across the heaving seas. The Spanish captains, fighting to maintain control of their overladen vessels, found themselves in a battle not against human enemies, but against the raw power of nature itself. The treasure fleet, which had seemed so formidable when it departed Havana, proved tragically vulnerable to the hurricane's fury. One by one, the ships began to founder. The Nuestra Señora de la Regla, carrying over 1 million pieces of eight, was driven onto the reefs near present-day Vero Beach. The Santo Cristo de San Roman, laden with silver ingots, broke apart in the pounding surf. The Urca de Lima, though it managed to beach itself, was so badly damaged that it would never sail again. By dawn on July 31st, 10 of the 11 ships had been destroyed. Only the Griffin, the smallest vessel in the fleet, had managed to ride out the storm and continue toward Spain. The beaches of Florida's east coast were littered with the wreckage of the Spanish treasure fleet, broken masts, scattered cargo, and the bodies of sailors who had perished in the disaster. But the treasure itself, the millions of pieces of eight and countless artifacts of gold and silver, lay scattered across miles of coastline and buried in the shifting sands of the ocean floor. The Spanish authorities, recognizing the magnitude of the disaster, immediately began organizing salvage operations. Ships were dispatched from Havana and St. Augustine to recover whatever could be found, while soldiers established camps along the coast to guard against looters and claim jumpers. The news of the treasure fleet's destruction spread through the Caribbean like wildfire. In every port, sailors and merchants discussed the implications of such a catastrophe. The Spanish Empire had lost not just a year's worth of precious metals, but ships, crews, and the carefully maintained schedule that kept the colonial economy functioning. For the former privateers gathering in Nassau, the news represented something else entirely. Opportunity on a scale that few had ever imagined. Millions of pieces of eight lay scattered along the Florida coast, guarded by a relative handful of Spanish soldiers and salvage workers. The Spanish recovery efforts, while determined, were hampered by the remote location of most wrecks, the difficulty of underwater salvage with the primitive equipment of the early 18th century, and the simple fact that the treasure was spread across too wide an area to guard effectively. Captain Henry Jennings, a former privateer who had operated successfully during the war, was among the first to recognize the potential of the situation. With a small fleet of fast vessels and crews of experienced sailors, he began conducting raids against the Spanish salvage camps. These attacks were not random acts of piracy, but carefully planned operations that demonstrated the tactical skills these men had learned during their years of legal predation. The success of Jennings's raids inspired others. Throughout the autumn of 1715, more and more former privateers began to arrive in Nassau, drawn by stories of easy wealth and the promise of action. They brought with them not just individual ships, but entire crews of skilled sailors, gunners, and fighters who had learned their trade in the service of the crown. The settlement of Nassau, which had been a modest colonial outpost, began to transform into something unprecedented in the history of the Caribbean. As more and more ships arrived, the harbour filled with vessels of every description: sleek sloops built for speed, sturdy brigantines capable of carrying heavy armament, and captured merchant vessels converted for use as floating bases. The men who gathered in Nassau represented a cross-section of maritime society. There were former naval officers who had served with distinction in the Royal Navy, skilled craftsmen who had learned their trades in the shipyards of England, and rough sailors who had spent their lives moving between legitimate and illegitimate employment. What united them was their shared experience of the recent war and their recognition that the skills they had developed could provide them with wealth and freedom beyond anything the legitimate world could offer. The leadership of this growing community fell naturally to men who had commanded respect during the war. Benjamin Hornigold, whose reputation for tactical brilliance and fair dealing had earned him the loyalty of experienced crews, emerged as one of the most influential figures in Nassau. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Hornigold understood that the success of their enterprise would depend not just on individual acts of piracy, but on the development of a sustainable system that could support a large community of sea raiders. Under Hornigold's influence, Nassau began to develop the infrastructure necessary to support a pirate republic. Shipwrights established workshops where captured vessels could be modified and repaired. Blacksmiths set up forges to maintain weapons and ship fittings. Tavern keepers and merchants arrived to serve the needs of the growing population. Most importantly, a network of informants and suppliers spread throughout the Caribbean, providing intelligence about shipping movements and markets for stolen goods. The transformation of Nassau from a sleepy colonial settlement into a bustling pirate stronghold did not go unnoticed by the British authorities. Governor Archibald Hamilton in Jamaica and the other colonial officials recognized that the concentration of armed men in the Bahamas represented a potential threat to legitimate commerce. But the British Empire in 1715 was still recovering from the Long War, and the resources available for colonial law enforcement were limited. Moreover, the legal status of many of the men gathering in Nassau remained ambiguous. Some still carried valid privateering commissions, documents that technically authorized them to attack enemy shipping. Others claimed that their actions against Spanish salvage operations were legitimate acts of war, arguing that the Treaty of Utrecht had not been properly implemented in the Caribbean. The British officials, lacking clear guidance from London and adequate military resources, chose to adopt a policy of watchful waiting. This official uncertainty provided exactly the breathing space that the emerging pirate community needed to establish itself. Throughout the winter of 1715 to 1716, Nassau continued to grow. Ships arrived almost daily, bringing new crews and tales of successful raids against Spanish shipping. The wealth generated by these operations flowed through the settlement, creating a boom economy that attracted entrepreneurs and opportunists from across the Caribbean. The social structure that emerged in Nassau differed markedly from the rigid hierarchies that governed most colonial settlements. The pirate community was fundamentally democratic, with decisions made by councils of captains and major actions subject to votes by the crews. This democratic tradition had its roots in the practices of the buccaneers who had operated in the Caribbean during the previous century, but it was reinforced by the shared experience of naval warfare and the practical necessity of maintaining cooperation among groups of heavily armed men. The Articles of Agreement that governed pirate crews represented some of the most advanced democratic documents of their time. These agreements, negotiated and signed by every member of a crew, established rules for the division of booty, the conduct of battles, and the resolution of disputes. They provided for the election of officers, the limitation of captains' authority, and the protection of individual rights in ways that were far more progressive than the legal codes that governed most contemporary societies. The success of Nassau as a pirate stronghold also depended on its relationship with the broader Caribbean economy. The Spanish Empire, despite its recent victory in the war, remained vulnerable to attack. The treasure fleets, though now more heavily guarded, still followed predictable routes and schedules. The merchant vessels that carried goods between the Spanish colonies and Europe continued to sail through waters that the pirates controlled. But the pirates of Nassau were not merely destructive raiders. They became an integral part of the Caribbean's underground economy, providing services that the legitimate colonial system could not or would not offer. They served as smugglers, carrying goods between colonies that official trade restrictions kept apart. They provided protection for merchants who were willing to pay for safe passage through dangerous waters. They even served as unofficial enforcers of contracts and agreements that the colonial legal system was too slow or corrupt to handle. The relationship between the pirates and the colonial authorities was complex and often contradictory. While the governors of Jamaica, Barbados, and other British colonies officially condemned piracy, they also recognized the economic benefits that the pirates brought to their territories. The pirates needed to sell their stolen goods, and the colonial merchants needed access to luxury items and precious metals that were difficult to obtain through legal channels. This symbiotic relationship created a network of corruption and collusion that extended from the lowest-ranking customs officials to the highest levels of colonial government. Governors who officially condemned piracy often found themselves entertaining pirate captains at their dinner tables. Merchants who publicly supported law and order privately negotiated contracts for stolen goods. Naval officers who were supposed to suppress piracy sometimes found it more profitable to look the other way when certain ships passed through their patrol areas. The Spanish authorities, meanwhile, watched the growth of Nassau with growing alarm. The raids against their treasure salvage operations had been costly and embarrassing, but they represented only a small fraction of the total damage that the pirates were inflicting on Spanish commerce. Spanish merchant ships were being captured regularly, their cargoes seized, and their crews held for ransom. The coastal settlements of the Spanish Main lived in constant fear of pirate raids. The Spanish response to the pirate threat was hampered by the same factors that had made the treasure fleet vulnerable to the hurricane of 1715. The Spanish Empire was vast, but thinly defended, with limited naval resources spread across thousands of miles of coastline. The Spanish Navy, though formidable in European waters, wasn't well suited to the guerrilla warfare tactics that the pirates employed in the Caribbean. As 1716 began, the stage was set for the Golden Age of Piracy to unfold. Nassau had become a functioning pirate republic, with a growing population of skilled seafarers, a thriving economy based on plunder and trade, and a democratic system of government that provided stability and legitimacy to their operations. The Spanish Empire, wounded by the loss of the treasure fleet and struggling to defend its vast colonial holdings, provided a rich and vulnerable target for pirate raids. The British authorities, caught between their official responsibility to suppress piracy and their unofficial recognition of the economic benefits that piracy brought to their colonies, remained paralyzed by indecision. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the Caribbean and create legends that would endure for centuries. In the taverns of Nassau, men who had once fought for king and country now planned raids that would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. They spoke of democracy and freedom, of brotherhood and shared adventure, of a way of life that offered excitement and wealth to any man brave enough to seize it. They were creating something unprecedented in the history of the Caribbean, a republic of pirates that would challenge the established order and offer an alternative to the rigid hierarchies of colonial society. The transformation was not without its ironies. These men, who had served the crown with distinction during the war, were now engaged in activities that directly threatened British commercial interests. The skills they had learned in service to the Empire were being used to challenge the Empire's authority. The democratic ideals that had emerged from their shared military experience were being applied to create a society that existed outside the bounds of conventional law. But for the moment, these contradictions seemed unimportant. Nassau was prospering. The Spanish treasure ships continued to sail their predictable routes, and the colonial authorities seemed unable or unwilling to take decisive action. The pirates of Nassau had created a world where merit counted for more than birth, where wealth could be won by courage and skill rather than inherited, and where men could live free from the petty tyrannies that governed most of the civilized world. The year 1716 would prove to be the beginning of the most spectacular period in the history of Caribbean piracy. The men who gathered in Nassau would become legends, their names forever associated with the romance and adventure of the Golden Age of Piracy. But in the quiet taverns of Nassau, as the winter of 1715 gave way to the spring of 1716, they were simply sailors and soldiers trying to make sense of a world that had changed around them, using the skills they had learned in war to build something new and dangerous and unprecedented in the warm waters of the Caribbean. The morning sun cast long shadows across the harbour of Nassau as Captain Benjamin Hornigold stood on the quarterdeck of his sloop, the Benjamin. From this vantage point, he could see the transformation that had overtaken the settlement in the months since word of the Spanish treasure fleet's destruction had spread through the Caribbean. What had once been a modest colonial outpost now bustled with the activity of a major maritime centre. The harbour itself told the story of this remarkable transformation. Vessels of every description crowded the anchorage, sleek Bermuda sloops built for speed, sturdy brigantines capable of mounting heavy armament, and captured merchant ships in various stages of conversion for piratical use. The forest of masts and rigging created a complex web of shadows and light that shifted with the gentle motion of the anchored fleet. Hornigold had arrived in Nassau in the autumn of 1715, bringing with him not just his own ship and crew, but a reputation earned through years of successful privateering during the late war. His approach to piracy differed markedly from the crude smash-and-grab tactics that many associated with sea robbery. Instead, he applied the principles of naval warfare that he had learned during his years of legal predation, treating piracy as a business that required careful planning, skilled execution, and sustainable practices. The crew of the Benjamin reflected this professional approach. Unlike the desperate outcasts that populated many pirate ships, Hornigold's men were experienced sailors who had chosen piracy as a career rather than a last resort. They maintained their weapons with the care of professional soldiers, kept their ship in pristine condition, and conducted their operations with the precision of a military unit. On this particular morning, Hornigold was preparing to address a gathering of pirate captains who had requested his guidance on a matter of considerable importance. The success of Nassau as a pirate stronghold had created unexpected challenges. The growing population of sea rovers had attracted the attention of both Spanish and British authorities, and there were signs that official patience with the pirate republic was beginning to wear thin. The meeting took place in the largest tavern in Nassau, a rambling wooden structure that had been expanded several times to accommodate the settlement's growing population. The main room was thick with pipe smoke and the salt-tinged air that seemed to permeate every building in the maritime community. Around rough wooden tables, men who commanded some of the most feared vessels in the Caribbean discussed the future of their unusual republic. The diversity of the assembled captains reflected the complex origins of Nassau's pirate community. There were former Royal Navy officers who had served with distinction in European waters, experienced privateers who had learned their trade in the Caribbean, and rough sailors who had worked their way up from the lower decks through courage and skill. What united them was their shared recognition that the conventional world offered them little, while the pirate life provided opportunities for wealth, adventure, and freedom that could be found nowhere else. The immediate issue facing the assembly was the question of governance. As Nassau's population had grown, so had the complexity of managing a community of armed men who were fundamentally opposed to conventional authority. Disputes over prize divisions, conflicts between crews, and questions about the use of common facilities had become increasingly frequent. The democratic traditions that governed individual pirate crews needed to be extended to encompass the entire community. Hornigold addressed the assembly with the calm confidence that had made him a natural leader. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "we have created something here that has never existed before in the Caribbean. Nassau has become a place where men can live free from the tyrannies that govern the rest of the world. But freedom without order is merely chaos, and chaos will destroy us as surely as any Spanish fleet. The proposal that emerged from the discussion was both practical and revolutionary. The pirates of Nassau would establish a formal republic with elected representatives, written laws, and institutions capable of governing a community of several thousand people. The model they chose drew heavily on the democratic traditions of individual pirate crews, but expanded these principles to create a system of government that could manage the complex affairs of a major maritime center. The centerpiece of the new system was the Council of Captains, a body that would include representatives from every active pirate crew based in Nassau. The council would meet regularly to discuss matters of common concern, resolve disputes between crews, and coordinate major operations that required the participation of multiple ships. Most importantly, the council would have the authority to negotiate with external powers, giving Nassau a unified voice in its dealings with the Spanish, British, and other colonial authorities. The establishment of the council represented a remarkable achievement in democratic governance. At a time when most of the world lived under various forms of autocracy, the pirates of Nassau had created a system that provided for genuine popular participation in government. Every crew member had a voice in selecting his captain, every captain had a vote in the council, and major decisions were subject to debate and discussion rather than arbitrary decree. The practical benefits of this system quickly became apparent. The council established standard rates for various services, from ship repair to the purchase of supplies, preventing the kind of price gouging that had plagued other pirate strongholds. It created a system of courts to resolve disputes, with judges selected from among the most respected captains and procedures that emphasized fairness and swift resolution. Most importantly, it established protocols for the division of communal prizes, ensuring that the wealth generated by major operations was distributed fairly among all participants. The success of Nassau's democratic experiment attracted attention throughout the Caribbean. Sailors in Port Royal and Bridgetown spoke admiringly of a place where ordinary seamen could rise to positions of authority based on merit rather than birth. Merchants in Havana and Cartagena worried about the implications of a well-organized pirate republic that could coordinate large-scale operations against Spanish shipping. Colonial governors from Jamaica to the Carolinas watched nervously as their most skilled sailors and craftsmen began to drift toward the Bahamas. The Spanish authorities recognized that Nassau represented a threat unlike any they had faced before. Previous pirate strongholds had been temporary affairs, bases of operation that could be easily abandoned when official pressure became too intense. Nassau, however, was developing into a permanent settlement with the infrastructure and governance necessary to sustain long-term resistance to Spanish power. The Spanish response came in the form of increased naval patrols and diplomatic pressure on the British authorities. Spanish warships began to appear regularly in the waters around the Bahamas, intercepting ships bound for Nassau and demanding that the British take action against the pirate republic. Spanish diplomats in London pressed for official action, arguing that the pirates of Nassau represented a direct threat to the peace that had been established by the Treaty of Utrecht. The British response to these pressures was complicated by the ambiguous legal status of many of the men gathered in Nassau. Some pirates still carried valid privateering commissions, documents that had authorized them to attack Spanish shipping during the recent war. Others claimed that their actions were legitimate acts of war, arguing that the peace treaty had not been properly implemented in the Caribbean. The British authorities, lacking clear guidance from London and adequate military resources in the region, found themselves caught between their official responsibility to suppress piracy and their unofficial recognition of the economic benefits that the pirates brought to British colonies. This official uncertainty provided exactly the breathing space that Nassau needed to consolidate its position. Throughout 1716, the pirate republic continued to grow and prosper. New ships arrived regularly, bringing skilled crews and tales of successful operations against Spanish targets. The wealth generated by these raids flowed through Nassau's economy, creating a boom that attracted entrepreneurs and opportunists from across the Caribbean. The social structure that emerged in Nassau differed markedly from the rigid hierarchies that governed most colonial settlements. The pirate community was fundamentally egalitarian, with positions of authority earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. A man who had served as a common sailor on a merchant vessel could find himself commanding a warship if he proved himself capable in battle. A craftsman who had worked in the shipyards of England could establish himself as a wealthy businessman if he could provide services that the pirate community needed. This social mobility was reflected in the physical development of Nassau itself. The settlement expanded rapidly, with new buildings constructed to serve the needs of the growing population. Shipyards appeared along the waterfront, equipped with the tools and materials necessary to maintain and modify the pirate fleet. Warehouses were built to store the goods that flowed through Nassau's underground economy. Taverns and boarding houses provided accommodation for sailors between voyages. The most impressive development was the construction of Fort Nassau, a fortification that protected the harbor and served as a symbol of the pirate republic's permanence. The fort was built through the collective effort of the entire community, with skilled craftsmen directing the work and ordinary crew members providing the labor. The guns that armed the fort were salvaged from captured Spanish ships, and the powder magazine was stocked with explosives obtained through raids on Spanish supply vessels. The completion of Fort Nassau marked a turning point in the development of the pirate republic. The fort provided protection against naval attack, but it also represented a psychological commitment to the permanence of the settlement. The pirates of Nassau were no longer simply raiders who used the island as a temporary base. They had become the founders of a new society, one that challenged the established order and offered an alternative to the rigid hierarchies of colonial life. The success of Nassau attracted some of the most skilled and ambitious sailors in the Caribbean. Among those who arrived during this period was Samuel Bellamy, a former privateer whose reputation for fair dealing and tactical brilliance had earned him the respect of sailors throughout the region. Bellamy, who would later become known as Black Sam, represented the best of the pirate tradition, a skilled seaman who had chosen piracy not from desperation, but from a genuine belief that it offered a better way of life than the conventional world. Bellamy's arrival in Nassau coincided with the emergence of a new phase in the Pirate Republic's development. The initial period of growth and consolidation was giving way to a more ambitious phase in which the pirates began to contemplate operations on a scale that would challenge the established powers directly. The Spanish treasure fleets, despite increased protection, continued to follow predictable routes and schedules. The merchant vessels that carried goods between the Spanish colonies and Europe represented targets whose capture could yield enormous wealth. The planning of these major operations required the kind of coordination and cooperation that Nassau's democratic institutions had been designed to facilitate. The Council of Captains met regularly to discuss intelligence reports, coordinate timing, and ensure that all participants understood their roles in complex multi-ship operations. The result was a level of strategic planning that had never before been achieved by pirate organizations. The first major test of Nassau's new capabilities came in the form of an ambitious plan to intercept a Spanish treasure fleet en route from Cartagena to Seville. The operation required the coordination of more than a dozen ships, precise timing to intercept the Spanish vessels at the optimal point in their journey, and careful planning to divide the enormous anticipated prize among the participating crews. The success of the operation exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The Spanish fleet, despite its escort of warships, proved unable to resist the coordinated attack of the Nassau pirates. The captured treasure, valued at over 2 million pieces of eight, was divided according to the principles established by the Council of Captains, with shares allocated based on the contribution of each crew to the operation's success. The aftermath of this triumph demonstrated both the strengths and the potential weaknesses of Nassau's democratic system. The successful captains returned to heroes' welcomes, their crews enriched beyond their wildest dreams. The taverns of Nassau filled with celebrations that lasted for days as the pirates reveled in their victory over the Spanish Empire. The success of the operation proved that the Pirate Republic could challenge the established powers on their own terms and emerge victorious. But the very success of the operation also attracted unwanted attention. The Spanish authorities, stung by the loss of such an enormous treasure, began to organize a more systematic response to the pirate threat. Spanish warships began to patrol the Caribbean in greater numbers, and Spanish diplomats increased their pressure on the British authorities to take action against Nassau. The British, meanwhile, found themselves facing criticism from their own merchants, who complained that the success of the pirates was disrupting legitimate trade throughout the Caribbean. The growing external pressure on Nassau coincided with internal challenges that tested the Pirate Republic's democratic institutions. The enormous wealth generated by the successful treasure fleet operation created new tensions within the community. Some captains began to question whether the egalitarian principles that had guided Nassau's development were compatible with the realities of managing such vast resources. Others worried that the success of the operation had made Nassau too visible, attracting attention that could ultimately destroy the pirate republic. These tensions came to a head during a particularly contentious meeting of the Council of Captains in the autumn of 1716. The immediate issue was the question of how to respond to increased Spanish naval activity in the waters around the Bahamas. Some captains favored a more aggressive approach, arguing that Nassau should use its growing strength to drive the Spanish Navy from Caribbean waters entirely. Others preferred a more cautious strategy, believing that the pirates should focus on consolidating their gains rather than risking everything in a direct confrontation with Spanish power. The debate reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature and purpose of the pirate republic. Some saw Nassau as a revolutionary experiment that should challenge the established order directly, creating a new form of society that could serve as a model for the rest of the world. Others viewed piracy as essentially a business venture, one that should be conducted with the minimum risk necessary to generate maximum profit. The resolution of this debate would have profound implications for the future of Nassau and the broader Golden Age of Piracy. The decisions made by the Council of Captains during this critical period would determine whether the pirate republic would evolve into a permanent challenge to the established order or remain a temporary aberration in the history of the Caribbean. The outcome of the debate was shaped by the arrival of new personalities who would dominate the next phase of Nassau's development. Among these was Edward Teach, a former privateer whose imposing physical presence and tactical brilliance had already earned him a fearsome reputation among Spanish sailors. Teach, who would later become known as Blackbeard, represented a different approach to piracy, one that emphasized psychological warfare and dramatic spectacle rather than the businesslike efficiency that had characterized the earlier period of Nassau's development. The emergence of figures like Teach marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of Nassau and the broader Golden Age of piracy. The democratic experiment that had characterized the pirate republic's early years would be tested by the ambitions of individual captains who sought to build personal empires rather than contribute to collective enterprises. The tension between democratic ideals and individual ambition would shape the final chapters of Nassau's remarkable story. As 1716 drew to a close, Nassau stood at the height of its power and influence. The pirate republic had created a functioning democratic society that provided its citizens with opportunities for wealth, adventure, and freedom that could be found nowhere else in the Caribbean. The success of major operations against Spanish shipping had demonstrated that the pirates could challenge the established powers on their own terms and emerge victorious. But the very success of Nassau also contained the seeds of its eventual downfall. The attention that the pirate republic had attracted from Spanish and British authorities would ultimately prove impossible to deflect. The tensions between democratic ideals and individual ambition would eventually tear the community apart. The golden age of piracy that Nassau had launched would reach its climax in the years ahead, But it would also face challenges that would test the limits of what a democratic society of sea rovers could achieve. The story of Nassau's rise represented one of the most remarkable experiments in democratic governance in the early modern world. At a time when most of humanity lived under various forms of autocracy, the pirates of Nassau had created a society that provided for genuine popular participation in government, social mobility based on merit rather than birth, and economic opportunities that were available to all citizens regardless of their origins. The legacy of this experiment would endure long after Nassau itself had fallen to the forces of conventional authority. The democratic ideals that had governed the pirate republic would inspire future generations of revolutionaries and reformers. The stories of individual pirates who had risen from humble origins to positions of wealth and power would become legends that would capture the imagination of people throughout the world. But for the moment, as 1716 gave way to 1717, Nassau remained a living reality rather than a historical memory. The pirate republic continued to grow and prosper, attracting new citizens and expanding its influence throughout the Caribbean. The democratic institutions that governed the community continued to function, providing stability and legitimacy to a society that existed outside the bounds of conventional law. The next chapter of Nassau's story would be written by a new generation of pirate captains who would push the boundaries of what was possible for a democratic society of sea rovers. These men would achieve fame and fortune that would make them legends, but they would also face challenges that would test the limits of their remarkable republic. The spring of 1717 brought new faces to Nassau's bustling harbour, and among them was a figure who would embody both the highest ideals and the deepest contradictions of the pirate republic. Samuel Bellamy had arrived from the Massachusetts colony with a reputation that preceded him. A skilled sailor who had chosen the pirate life not from desperation, but from a philosophical conviction that it offered a more just and equitable way of life than the conventional world. Bellamy's background differed markedly from that of most pirates. Born to a respectable family in Devon, he had received an education that included not only the practical skills of seamanship, but also exposure to the political and philosophical ideas that were beginning to challenge the established order throughout Europe. His decision to embrace piracy stemmed not from economic necessity, but from a genuine belief that the pirate life offered a more democratic and egalitarian society than could be found in the conventional world. The young man who walked the streets of Nassau in the spring of 1717 carried himself with the confidence of someone who had found his calling. Bellamy stood tall and lean, with the sun-darkened complexion of a man who had spent years at sea. His clothes, while practical, were cut from fine materials and tailored with an attention to detail that spoke of a prosperity and good taste. Most remarkably, he wore his long black hair unpowdered and tied back in a simple queue, a style that marked him as someone who had consciously rejected the fashions of polite society. Those who met Bellamy during his first days in Nassau were struck by his articulate defense of the pirate life. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who justified their actions in terms of personal gain or necessity, Bellamy spoke of piracy as a form of social revolution. He argued that the existing system of government and commerce was fundamentally unjust, designed to benefit a small aristocratic elite at the expense of ordinary working people. The Pirate Republic, in his view, represented a practical alternative to this oppressive system. "They damn us for villains," Bellamy would later tell a captured merchant captain. "But there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, while we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Better to be a commander than a common man, since they have made honesty a sin, and the world a game of chance." This philosophical approach to piracy resonated strongly with many of the sailors who had gathered in Nassau. The democratic ideals that had shaped the Pirate Republic from its inception found their most articulate expression in Bellamy's speeches and writings. Under his influence, the pirates of Nassau began to see themselves not merely as criminals who had chosen a life outside the law, but as revolutionaries who were creating a new form of society based on principles of equality and justice. Bellamy's first major operation as a pirate captain demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his commitment to the democratic principles that governed pirate society. In partnership with another skilled captain named Palsgrave Williams, he planned and executed a series of raids against Spanish shipping that yielded enormous wealth while demonstrating a level of coordination and planning that impressed even the most experienced pirates. The success of these operations earned Bellamy the respect of his peers and the election to the Council of Captains that governed Nassau. His influence on the council was immediate and profound. Under his guidance, the pirates began to develop a more systematic approach to their operations, one that emphasized long-term planning and strategic thinking rather than opportunistic raids. The most significant innovation that Bellamy brought to Nassau was the development of what he called the Gentleman Pirate's Code, a set of principles that governed not only the conduct of individual crews, but the broader relationship between the Pirate Republic and the outside world. The code emphasized the humane treatment of prisoners, the protection of non-combatants, and the fair distribution of captured wealth. Most importantly, it established piracy as a political act rather than mere criminal activity, justified by the failures of conventional government to provide justice and opportunity for ordinary people. The implementation of the Gentleman Pirate's Code marked a turning point in the development of Nassau's pirate society. The code provided a moral framework that allowed the pirates to maintain their self-respect while engaging in activities that the outside world condemned as criminal. It also served as a powerful recruiting tool, attracting skilled sailors who might otherwise have been reluctant to join what they perceived as a criminal enterprise. The success of Bellamy's approach was demonstrated by the rapid growth of his crew and the increasing sophistication of his operations. By the autumn of 1717, he commanded a small fleet of vessels manned by some of the most skilled sailors in the Caribbean. His flagship, the Marianne, was a converted merchant vessel that had been modified for speed and armament, capable of outrunning most naval vessels while carrying enough guns to overwhelm merchant ships. The reputation of Black Sam Bellamy, as he had come to be known, spread throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Spanish merchants spoke his name with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, recognizing that his raids, while devastating to their commerce, were conducted with a professionalism and humanity that set them apart from the brutal attacks associated with other pirate captains. British colonial officials, meanwhile, found themselves in the awkward position of condemning a man whose actions were bringing considerable wealth to their territories through the underground economy that connected the pirate republic to the legitimate colonial world. The growing influence of Bellamy and his followers within Nassau's pirate society was not without its critics. Some of the older captains, men who had been operating in the Caribbean since the early days of the pirate republic, worried that the philosophical approach to piracy was making the community too visible and attracting unwanted attention from the authorities. They argued that the pirates should focus on enriching themselves rather than challenging the established social order. These tensions came to a head during a particularly contentious meeting of the Council of Captains in the winter of 1717. The immediate issue was a proposal by Bellamy to coordinate a major operation against a Spanish treasure fleet that was scheduled to depart from Cartagena in the spring. The operation would require the participation of virtually every active pirate crew based in Nassau, and its success would depend on the kind of precise coordination and timing that had become the hallmark of Bellamy's approach to piracy. The debate that followed revealed the deep philosophical divisions that had emerged within the pirate community. Bellamy's supporters argued that the operation represented an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against Spanish power in the Caribbean, demonstrating that the pirate republic could challenge the established authorities on their own terms. The proposed operation would yield enormous wealth, but more importantly, it would establish Nassau as a permanent force in Caribbean politics rather than a temporary irritation to be tolerated or suppressed. The opposition to Bellamy's proposal was led by some of the most experienced captains in Nassau, men who had been operating in the Caribbean since the early days of the pirate republic. These captains argued that the proposed operation was too ambitious and too visible, likely to provoke a response from the Spanish authorities that could destroy Nassau entirely. They preferred a more cautious approach, one that emphasized steady profit from smaller operations rather than the dramatic gestures that Bellamy favored. The debate continued for several days, with speeches and arguments that revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had developed within the pirate community. The pirates of Nassau were not simply criminals who had chosen a life outside the law, but thoughtful men who had developed a coherent philosophy of government and society. Their discussions of strategy and tactics were informed by a deep understanding of the political and economic forces that shaped the Caribbean world. The final vote on Bellamy's proposal was close, but it ultimately carried by a narrow margin. The decision to proceed with the operation reflected the growing influence of Bellamy's faction within the pirate community, but it also demonstrated the democratic character of Nassau's government. Even the most controversial decisions were subject to debate and discussion, with the final outcome determined by the collective will of the pirate captains rather than the arbitrary decree of a single leader. The preparation for the operation revealed the sophisticated infrastructure that Nassau had developed to support large-scale pirate operations. The settlement's shipyards worked around the clock to modify vessels for the specific requirements of the mission, while the island's weaponsmiths produced specialized equipment needed for the attack. Intelligence networks that extended throughout the Caribbean provided detailed information about Spanish shipping schedules and naval movements. The operation itself was planned with the precision of a military campaign. The pirate fleet would be divided into 3 squadrons, each with specific responsibilities and objectives. The first squadron would intercept the Spanish treasure fleet in the open ocean, using speed and surprise to overwhelm the escort vessels. The second squadron would secure the captured ships and their cargo, while the third squadron would provide protection against any Spanish naval forces that might respond to the attack. The success of the operation would depend not only on tactical coordination, but also on the maintenance of secrecy until the moment of attack. The pirates of Nassau had learned from previous operations that the Spanish authorities had developed an extensive intelligence network of their own, and that premature disclosure of their plans could result in the reinforcement of Spanish defenses or the alteration of shipping schedules. As the spring of 1718 approached, Nassau bustled with the activity of a community preparing for its greatest challenge. The operation against the Spanish treasure fleet represented more than just another raid. It was a test of whether the pirate republic could maintain its independence and prosperity in the face of growing pressure from the established authorities. The philosophical questions that had been raised during the debate over Bellamy's proposal continued to influence the development of Nassau's pirate society. The success of the Gentleman Pirates Code had attracted new recruits to the pirate ranks, men who saw themselves as part of a revolutionary movement rather than a criminal enterprise. These new pirates brought with them not only skills and experience, but also ideas about how the pirate republic should develop and what role it should play in the broader Caribbean world. The intellectual sophistication of Nassau's pirate community was reflected in the quality of the debates that took place in the settlement's taverns and meeting halls. The pirates discussed not only the practical aspects of their operations, but also the broader implications of their activities for the development of colonial society. They debated questions of justice and morality, the proper relationship between government and citizen, and the role of violence in social change. These discussions were not merely academic exercises, but had practical implications for the conduct of pirate operations. The principles established by the Gentleman Pirates Code influenced how the pirates treated their prisoners, how they conducted their raids, and how they related to the civilian populations of the territories where they operated. The code provided a framework for maintaining discipline and morale within the pirate crews, while ensuring that their activities retained the moral legitimacy that was essential to their self-respect. The growing sophistication of Nassau's pirate society was also reflected in the physical development of the settlement. The original collection of rough wooden buildings had been expanded and improved, with substantial structures that reflected the prosperity and permanence of the pirate republic. The harbour facilities had been upgraded to handle the increasing volume of shipping that flowed through Nassau's underground economy. Most importantly, the fortifications that protected the settlement had been strengthened and expanded, providing the military capabilities necessary to defend the pirate republic against external threats. The success of Nassau as a pirate stronghold had not gone unnoticed by the authorities in London, Madrid, and the colonial capitals of the Caribbean. The British government, under pressure from Spanish diplomats and British merchants, had begun to consider more aggressive measures to suppress the pirate republic. The Spanish authorities, meanwhile, were organizing their own military response to the growing threat that Nassau represented to their colonial empire. The approaching confrontation between the pirate republic and the established authorities would test not only the military capabilities of Nassau, but also the political and social institutions that had made the pirate community so successful. The democratic ideals that had guided the development of the pirate republic would be challenged by the practical necessities of warfare and survival. As Bellamy and his followers prepared for their greatest operation, they were aware that they were not merely planning another raid, but preparing for a confrontation that would determine the future of their remarkable experiment in democratic governance. The success or failure of the operation would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of profit and loss. It would determine whether the pirate republic could maintain its independence and continue to offer an alternative to the rigid hierarchies that governed the conventional world. The spring of 1718 would mark the climax of Nassau's Golden Age, the moment when the pirate republic would either establish itself as a permanent force in Caribbean politics or face the beginning of its inevitable decline. The men who had created this remarkable society understood that they were living through a pivotal moment in history, one that would determine not only their own fate, but the broader question of whether democratic ideals could survive in a world dominated by aristocratic privilege and imperial power. The story of Black Sam Bellamy and the Gentleman Pirate's Code represented the highest achievement of Nassau's pirate society, but it also contained the seeds of the Republic's eventual downfall. The very success of the democratic experiment had attracted the attention of powerful enemies who would not tolerate the continued existence of a society that challenged their authority so directly. The confrontation that lay ahead would test the limits of what a democratic community of sea rovers could achieve in the face of overwhelming odds. Chapter 4. The Thunder of Blackbeard. In the late months of 1717, as Nassau's pirate republic reached the height of its democratic experiment, a new figure appeared in the harbour whose presence would alter the character of the Golden Age of Piracy. Edward Teach arrived aboard a modest sloop, but his reputation had preceded him through the taverns and docks of every major port in the Caribbean. The man who would become known as Blackbeard brought with him a different philosophy of piracy, one that emphasized psychological warfare and theatrical spectacle over the gentlemanly conduct that had characterized the earlier period of Nassau's development. Teach's physical presence was itself a form of psychological warfare. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of imposing bearing that commanded attention in any gathering. His most distinctive feature was the magnificent black beard that had earned him his nickname, a carefully maintained cascade of hair that he would braid with colored ribbons and weave with slow burning hemp to create a cloud of smoke around his head during battle. The effect was both magnificent and terrifying, transforming him into a figure that seemed to emerge from the darkest legends of the sea. The arrival of Blackbeard in Nassau marked the beginning of a new phase in the development of the pirate republic. Where Samuel Bellamy had emphasized the democratic ideals and philosophical justifications of piracy, Teach focused on the raw power and psychological impact that could be achieved through carefully orchestrated displays of force. His approach to piracy was theatrical in the extreme, designed to create a reputation so fearsome that his intended victims would surrender without resistance rather than face the consequences of opposing him. The transformation of Edward Teach into Blackbeard was a calculated process that demonstrated his understanding of the psychological aspects of piracy. He studied the legends and stories that surrounded the most feared pirates of the past, identifying the elements that made certain figures particularly terrifying to their contemporaries. He then systematically incorporated these elements into his own persona, creating a character that was both authentic and carefully constructed. The process began with his appearance. Teach allowed his naturally dark beard to grow to extraordinary length, then began the practice of braiding it with colored ribbons and small bells that would jingle as he moved. He dressed in the finest clothes that could be obtained through piracy, favoring dark colors and rich fabrics that emphasized his imposing stature. Most dramatically, he began the practice of weaving slow-burning hemp into his beard before battles, creating a cloud of smoke around his head that made him appear to be a figure emerging from the fires of hell itself. The psychological impact of this theatrical approach was extraordinary. Spanish sailors who encountered Blackbeard spoke of him in hushed tones, describing encounters with a figure who seemed to be more supernatural than human. The stories that circulated about his exploits grew in the telling, creating a legend that often exceeded the reality of his actual activities. This reputation became one of Blackbeard's most effective weapons, allowing him to capture ships and control territory through the sheer force of his fearsome reputation. The methods that Blackbeard employed in his pirate operations differed markedly from those of his contemporaries. Where other pirates focused on the practical aspects of ship capture and cargo seizure, Teach understood that the psychological impact of his actions could be as important as their immediate material results. He developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies that accompanied his attacks, designed to create maximum psychological impact on both his victims and his own crew. The most famous of these rituals was the practice of holding mock trials for captured ship captains, complete with formal proceedings and theatrical sentences. These trials served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment for Blackbeard's crew, they created additional terror among his victims, and they reinforced his own authority as a leader who could control the life and death of others. The trials were elaborate affairs, with Blackbeard presiding as judge, while his crew served as jury and executioner. The success of Blackbeard's theatrical approach to piracy was demonstrated by the rapid growth of his crew and the increasing scope of his operations. By the winter of 1717, he commanded a small fleet of vessels and had established himself as one of the most feared pirates operating in the Caribbean. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a converted French slave ship that had been heavily armed and modified for piracy. The ship mounted 40 guns and could carry a crew of over 300 men, making it one of the most formidable vessels in the Caribbean. The Queen Anne's Revenge became the stage for some of Blackbeard's most elaborate theatrical performances. The ship was decorated with skull and crossbones flags, painted in dark colors that emphasized its menacing appearance, and equipped with special effects that could create dramatic visual displays during battles. Blackbeard understood that the appearance of his ship was as important as its actual fighting capabilities, and he spared no expense in creating a vessel that would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. The crew of the Queen Anne's Revenge reflected Blackbeard's understanding of the importance of psychological warfare in piracy. He recruited men who were not only skilled sailors and fighters, but also capable of contributing to the theatrical aspects of his operations. The crew included musicians who could provide dramatic soundtracks for battles, skilled craftsmen who could create props and costumes, and men who were naturally gifted at intimidation and psychological manipulation. The daily life aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge was itself a form of theatre. Blackbeard maintained strict discipline among his crew, but he also encouraged the kind of dramatic behavior that would enhance their fearsome reputation. The pirates under his command were expected to maintain their weapons and equipment in perfect condition, but they were also expected to contribute to the elaborate rituals and ceremonies that were an integral part of Blackbeard's approach to piracy. The most famous of these rituals was the practice of holding elaborate drinking parties in the ship's hold, complete with burning sulfur and gunpowder to create a hellish atmosphere. These parties served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment for the crew during long voyages. They created stories that would spread throughout the Caribbean and enhance Blackbeard's reputation, and they reinforced the bonds of loyalty that held the crew together in the face of the dangers they faced. The success of Blackbeard's theatrical approach to piracy was not limited to its psychological impact. The fear that his reputation inspired often allowed him to capture ships without firing a shot, reducing the risk to his crew and preserving the value of the captured vessels and cargo. Merchant captains who encountered the Queen Anne's Revenge frequently surrendered immediately upon recognizing the distinctive appearance of Blackbeard's flagship, preferring to lose their cargo rather than risk the brutal treatment that his reputation promised. The relationship between Blackbeard and the other pirates operating from Nassau was complex and often tense. Many of the captains who had been instrumental in establishing the Pirate Republic viewed Teach's theatrical approach with suspicion, arguing that his methods were attracting unwanted attention from the authorities and undermining the carefully constructed image of pirates as democratic revolutionaries rather than bloodthirsty criminals. the philosophical differences between Blackbeard and the other pirate leaders came to a head during a series of heated debates in the Council of Captains during the winter of 1717. The immediate issue was Blackbeard's proposal to conduct a series of raids against colonial settlements along the North American coast, operations that would involve the kind of spectacular attacks that had become his trademark. The proposal was controversial because it represented a significant escalation in the scope of pirate operations, moving beyond attacks on shipping to direct assaults on colonial territory. The debate that followed revealed the deep divisions that had emerged within Nassau's pirate community. Blackbeard's supporters argued that the proposed raids would demonstrate the power of the pirate republic and discourage the authorities from taking action against Nassau. They pointed to the success of his theatrical approach in previous operations, arguing that the psychological impact of spectacular attacks could be more effective than traditional military tactics. The opposition to Blackbeard's proposal was led by Samuel Bellamy and other advocates of the Gentleman Pirates Code. They argued that attacks on colonial settlements would violate the principles that had guided the development of the pirate republic, particularly the commitment to protect non-combatants and limit violence to what was necessary for the success of their operations. More practically, they worried that such attacks would provoke a military response from the colonial authorities that could destroy Nassau entirely. The debate continued for several days, with arguments that revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had developed within the pirate community. The fundamental question was whether the pirate republic should continue to operate according to the democratic and humanitarian principles that had guided its development, or whether it should adopt more aggressive tactics that might be more effective but would also transform the nature of pirate society. The final vote on Blackbeard's proposal was close, but it ultimately failed to achieve the majority necessary for approval. The decision reflected the continued influence of the democratic faction within the pirate community, but it also demonstrated the growing divisions that were beginning to weaken the unity that had made Nassau so successful. Blackbeard's supporters accepted the decision, but it was clear that the philosophical differences that had been revealed during the debate would continue to influence the development of the pirate republic. The rejection of his proposal by the Council of Captains marked a turning point in Blackbeard's relationship with Nassau's pirate community. While he continued to use the settlement as a base for his operations, he began to develop independent sources of support and supply that would allow him to operate without the approval of the council. This independence would eventually lead to his departure from Nassau and the establishment of his own pirate stronghold along the North American coast. The period following the council's rejection of Blackbeard's proposal was marked by increased tension within the pirate community. The theatrical approach to piracy that Teach had pioneered continued to attract new recruits, particularly young men who were drawn to the dramatic aspects of his operations. These new pirates often lacked the discipline and philosophical commitment that had characterized the earlier generation of Nassau's pirates, and their presence began to change the character of the pirate republic. The growing influence of Blackbeard's approach was also reflected in the operations of other pirate captains who began to adopt elements of his theatrical style. The use of intimidation and psychological warfare became more common among Nassau's pirates, as captains recognized the effectiveness of Blackbeard's methods in reducing resistance and preserving their crews. The result was a gradual transformation in the character of Caribbean piracy, as the gentlemanly conduct that had characterized the earlier period gave way to more aggressive and theatrical approaches. The success of Blackbeard's theatrical piracy was demonstrated by a series of spectacular operations that he conducted during the spring and summer of 1718. The most famous of these was his blockade of the port of Charleston, South Carolina, an operation that combined military tactics with psychological warfare to achieve maximum impact. The blockade demonstrated both the power of the pirate republic and the growing boldness of its most theatrical practitioners. The Charleston blockade began as a conventional pirate operation, with Blackbeard's fleet intercepting merchant vessels entering and leaving the port. However, Teach transformed the operation into a spectacular demonstration of pirate power by demanding ransom from the city's authorities and threatening to burn captured ships in the harbor if his demands were not met. The psychological impact of the blockade was enormous, creating panic among the city's population and demonstrating the vulnerability of colonial settlements to pirate attack. The success of the Charleston blockade enhanced Blackbeard's reputation throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Stories of the operation spread through the colonial press and the informal networks of communication that connected maritime communities throughout the Atlantic world. The blockade became a symbol of pirate power and a demonstration of the failure of the colonial authorities to protect their territories from pirate attack. The growing fame of Blackbeard and his theatrical approach to piracy also attracted the attention of the authorities in London and the colonial capitals. The British government, under increasing pressure from merchants and colonial officials, began to consider more aggressive measures to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The Spanish authorities, meanwhile, recognized that the success of theatrical piracy was inspiring other pirates to adopt similar tactics, creating a more dangerous and unpredictable threat to their colonial empire. The response of the authorities to the growing threat of theatrical piracy would ultimately lead to the confrontation that would determine the fate of Nassau's pirate republic. The success of Blackbeard's approach had demonstrated the power of psychological warfare and theatrical spectacle, but it had also made the pirate community more visible and more vulnerable to organized suppression efforts. The period of Blackbeard's greatest success was also marked by the beginning of his eventual downfall. The theatrical approach that had made him so feared and so successful had also made him a target for the authorities who were organizing a systematic campaign to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The psychological warfare that had been so effective against merchant captains and colonial officials would prove less effective against the professional military forces that were being assembled to hunt down the most notorious pirates. The transformation of Edward Teach into Blackbeard represented both the climax and the beginning of the end of Nassau's Golden Age. The theatrical piracy that he had pioneered demonstrated the power of psychological warfare and dramatic spectacle. But it also attracted the kind of attention that would ultimately destroy the pirate republic. The success of his approach inspired other pirates to adopt similar tactics, but it also provided the authorities with the justification they needed to organize a comprehensive campaign against Caribbean piracy. The legacy of Blackbeard's theatrical piracy would endure long after his death, inspiring countless stories and legends that would shape popular perceptions of piracy for centuries to come. The image of the fearsome pirate captain with his smoking beard and elaborate costumes became the archetypal representation of the Golden Age of piracy, overshadowing the more complex reality of the democratic experiment that had made Nassau so remarkable. The story of Blackbeard's rise and fall illustrates the tensions that existed within Nassau's pirate community between the democratic ideals that had guided its development and the individual ambitions that drove its most colorful personalities. The theatrical approach to piracy that Teach pioneered was both a natural extension of the psychological warfare that had always been part of pirate tactics and a departure from the gentlemanly conduct that had characterized the earlier period of Nassau's development. The success of Blackbeard's approach demonstrated the power of reputation and psychological warfare in the world of early 18th century piracy. The fear that his theatrical performances inspired often allowed him to achieve his objectives without the violence and bloodshed that characterized more conventional pirate operations. In this sense, his approach was both more humane and more effective than the brutal tactics that were often associated with piracy. However, the very success of theatrical piracy also created the conditions that would lead to its downfall. The spectacular nature of Blackbeard's operations made them impossible to ignore, attracting the attention of authorities who had previously been willing to tolerate piracy as a minor irritation. The psychological impact of his theatrical performances was so great that they created a sense of crisis among colonial officials that would ultimately lead to the organized campaign to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The period of Blackbeard's greatest influence within Nassau's pirate community was relatively brief, but its impact on the development of Caribbean piracy was profound and lasting. The theatrical approach that he pioneered would be adopted by other pirates and would become one of the defining characteristics of the Golden Age of piracy. The stories and legends that grew up around his exploits would shape popular perceptions of piracy for centuries to come, creating an image of the pirate captain that would overshadow the more complex reality of the democratic experiment that had made Nassau so remarkable. The summer of 1718 brought a series of challenges to Nassau's pirate republic that would test the resilience of the democratic institutions that had made the settlement so successful. The growing tensions between different factions within the pirate community, combined with increasing pressure from external authorities, created a volatile situation that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed society that had emerged from the chaos of the post-war Caribbean. The immediate catalyst for the crisis was the arrival of Charles Vane, a pirate captain whose reputation for violence and unpredictability had made him both feared and respected throughout the Caribbean. Vane's approach to piracy differed markedly from both the gentlemanly conduct advocated by Samuel Bellamy and the theatrical spectacle perfected by Blackbeard. Instead, he practiced a form of piracy that was notable for its brutal efficiency and its complete disregard for the humanitarian principles that had guided the development of Nassau's pirate society. Charles Vane had learned his trade during the violent period that followed the end of the War of Spanish Succession, when the Caribbean was filled with desperate men who had been cast adrift by the return of peace. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who had been privateers during the war, Vane had always operated outside the bounds of legal authority. His career had been marked by a series of increasingly brutal attacks on merchant shipping that had earned him both wealth and notoriety. The arrival of Vane in Nassau represented a challenge to the established order that went beyond mere personal rivalry. His methods and philosophy were fundamentally incompatible with the democratic ideals that had guided the development of the pirate republic. Where the Nassau pirates had developed elaborate codes of conduct and democratic procedures for making decisions, Vane ruled his crew through fear and intimidation. Where the established pirates had sought to minimize violence and treat their prisoners humanely, Vane's operations were characterized by unnecessary brutality and cruelty. The tensions between Vane and the established pirate leadership came to a head during a meeting of the Council of Captains in the late summer of 1718. The immediate issue was Vane's proposal to conduct a series of raids against British merchant shipping, operations that would violate the informal understanding that had allowed Nassau to coexist peacefully with the British colonial authorities. The proposal was controversial, not only because of its potential to provoke British retaliation, but also because it represented a fundamental challenge to the political arrangements that had made Nassau's prosperity possible. The debate that followed revealed the deep philosophical divisions that had emerged within Nassau's pirate community. Vane's supporters argued that the pirates had become too comfortable and too dependent on the tolerance of the British authorities. They claimed that the democratic ideals that had guided the development of the pirate republic had made the pirates soft and vulnerable, and that only a return to the brutal tactics of earlier generations could ensure their continued survival. The opposition to Vane's proposal was led by Benjamin Hornigold and other veteran captains who had been instrumental in establishing Nassau's democratic institutions. They argued that the success of the pirate republic had been built on the careful balance between piratical activities and political accommodation with the colonial authorities. They pointed out that attacks on British shipping would destroy this balance and provoke a military response that could destroy Nassau entirely. The debate continued for several days, with arguments that revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had developed within the pirate community. The fundamental question was whether the pirate republic should continue to operate according to the pragmatic principles that had guided its development, or whether it should adopt more aggressive tactics that might be more ideologically pure, but would also be more dangerous. The final vote on Vane's proposal was decisive, with the council rejecting his plan by a substantial margin. The decision reflected the continued dominance of the pragmatic faction within the pirate community, but it also demonstrated the growing tensions that were beginning to weaken the unity that had made Nassau so successful. Vane's supporters accepted the decision formally, but it was clear that the philosophical differences that had been revealed during the debate would continue to influence the development of the pirate republic. The rejection of his proposal by the Council of Captains marked the beginning of Charles Vane's transformation from a member of Nassau's pirate community into one of its most dangerous enemies. While he continued to use the settlement as a base for his operations, he began to develop independent sources of support and supply that would allow him to operate without the approval of the council. This independence would eventually lead to his departure from Nassau and his emergence as a leader of the faction that opposed the democratic ideals that had guided the pirate republic's development. The period following the council's rejection of Vane's proposal was marked by increased tension and violence within the pirate community. The brutal approach to piracy that Vane advocated continued to attract new recruits, particularly young men who were drawn to the promise of easy wealth and the excitement of violent adventure. These new pirates often lacked the discipline and philosophical commitment that had characterized the earlier generation of Nassau's pirates, and their presence began to change the character of the pirate republic. The growing influence of Vane's approach was also reflected in the operations of other pirate captains who began to adopt elements of his brutal tactics. The use of violence and intimidation became more common among Nassau's pirates, as captains recognized the effectiveness of Vane's methods in extracting information from prisoners and controlling reluctant crew members. The result was a gradual transformation in the character of Caribbean piracy, as the gentlemanly conduct that had characterized the earlier period gave way to more aggressive and violent approaches. The success of Vane's brutal piracy was demonstrated by a series of spectacular operations that he conducted during the autumn of 1718. The most notorious of these was his capture of a British merchant vessel carrying a cargo of manufactured goods and precious metals, an operation that combined military tactics with psychological warfare to achieve maximum impact. The capture demonstrated both the effectiveness of Vane's methods and the growing boldness of the faction that opposed Nassau's democratic leadership. The operation began as a conventional pirate attack, with Vane's sloop intercepting the merchant vessel in the waters off the Bahamas. However, Vane transformed the operation into a demonstration of pirate power by torturing the captured crew members in full view of other vessels in the area. The psychological impact of the operation was enormous, creating fear among merchant sailors and demonstrating the vulnerability of British commerce to pirate attack. The success of Vane's brutal approach enhanced his reputation among the more violent elements of the pirate community, but it also attracted the attention of the British authorities, who had previously been willing to tolerate piracy as a minor irritation. The torture of British subjects by a pirate operating from a British colonial territory created a diplomatic crisis that would ultimately lead to the organized campaign to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The growing fame of Charles Vane and his brutal approach to piracy also inspired other pirates to adopt similar tactics, creating a more dangerous and unpredictable threat to colonial commerce. The success of his methods demonstrated that violence and intimidation could be effective tools for controlling both prisoners and crew members, but it also made the pirate community more visible and more vulnerable to organized suppression efforts. The British response to the growing threat of brutal piracy came in the form of increased naval patrols and diplomatic pressure on the colonial authorities to take action against the pirate strongholds. The British government, under pressure from merchants and colonial officials, began to consider more aggressive measures to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The Spanish authorities, meanwhile, recognized that the success of brutal piracy was inspiring other pirates to adopt similar tactics, creating a more dangerous and unpredictable threat to their colonial empire. The period of Vane's greatest influence within Nassau's pirate community coincided with the arrival of another figure who would play a crucial role in the final phase of the Pirate Republic's development. Calico Jack Rackham arrived in Nassau during the autumn of 1718, bringing with him a reputation for cunning and tactical skill that had earned him the respect of pirates throughout the Caribbean. Rackham's approach to piracy differed from both the gentlemanly conduct advocated by Bellamy and the brutal tactics employed by Vane, instead emphasizing stealth and surprise over direct confrontation. John Rackham had earned his nickname Calico Jack from his habit of wearing brightly colored calico clothing that made him instantly recognizable to anyone who had encountered him. The colorful clothing was not merely a fashion statement, but a calculated element of his approach to piracy. Like Blackbeard's theatrical performances, Rackham's distinctive appearance served psychological purposes. But where Blackbeard sought to inspire terror, Rackham used his flamboyant style to create an image of casual confidence that often caused his enemies to underestimate his capabilities. The arrival of Calico Jack in Nassau represented the emergence of yet another distinct approach to the practice of piracy. Where other captains had focused on either the philosophical justifications of their activities or the dramatic spectacle of their operations, Rackham concentrated on the practical aspects of pirate leadership and crew management. His success as a pirate captain stemmed not from his ability to inspire fear or articulate democratic ideals, but from his skill at managing the complex human dynamics that governed life aboard a pirate vessel. Rackham's approach to piracy was notable for its emphasis on inclusivity and innovation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who maintained traditional hierarchies aboard their ships, Rackham was willing to experiment with unconventional crew compositions and leadership structures. This openness to innovation would prove to be both his greatest strength and the source of his most remarkable legacy within the pirate community. The most significant innovation that Rackham brought to Caribbean piracy was his willingness to accept women as full members of his crew. This decision was unprecedented in the male-dominated world of early 18th century seafaring, and it would ultimately lead to the emergence of two of the most famous figures in the history of piracy, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Anne Bonny arrived in Nassau as the wife of James Bonny, a small-time pirate who had attracted little attention within the broader pirate community. Born in Ireland to a family of modest means, Anne had emigrated to the Carolinas as a child and had grown up in the rough frontier society that characterized the colonial backcountry. Her marriage to James Bonny had been an attempt to escape the limitations that colonial society imposed on women, but she quickly discovered that the pirate world offered little more freedom than the conventional world she had left behind. The meeting between Anne Bonny and Calico Jack Rackham in a Nassau tavern during the winter of 1718 marked the beginning of both a romantic relationship and a revolutionary partnership that would challenge conventional assumptions about the role of women in pirate society. Rackham was immediately attracted to Anne's intelligence and fierce independence, while she was drawn to his willingness to treat her as an equal rather than as a subordinate or possession. The decision to include Anne Bonny as a full member of his crew was controversial within Nassau's pirate community. Many of the established captains argued that the presence of a woman aboard a pirate vessel would undermine discipline and create tensions that could destroy the careful balance that maintained crew loyalty. Others worried that the innovation would attract unwanted attention from the authorities and provide ammunition for critics who already portrayed pirates as lawless criminals who threatened the foundations of civilized society. Rackham's response to these criticisms demonstrated both his confidence in his own judgment and his commitment to the democratic ideals that had guided the development of Nassau's pirate republic. He argued that the success of piracy depended on attracting the most skilled and committed individuals available, regardless of their gender or background. He pointed out that many women possessed the intelligence, courage, and practical skills that were essential for successful pirate operations, and that excluding them from participation was both unjust and impractical. The debate over Anne Bonny's inclusion in Rackham's crew revealed the complex relationship between democratic ideals and social conventions within Nassau's pirate community. While the pirates had developed sophisticated democratic institutions and had rejected many of the hierarchical structures that governed conventional society, they had not fully escaped the gender assumptions that characterized their era. The presence of a woman as a full participant in pirate activities challenged these assumptions and forced the community to confront the logical implications of their democratic principles. The resolution of the debate came not through formal votes or council decisions, but through the practical demonstration of Anne Bonny's capabilities as a pirate. Her first operation with Rackham's crew was a raid against a Spanish merchant vessel that required both tactical skill and physical courage. Anne's performance during the operation was exemplary, demonstrating not only her ability to handle weapons and participate in combat, but also her skill at the psychological warfare that was an integral part of pirate tactics. The success of Anne Bonny's debut as a pirate helped to establish the precedent that would allow other women to join the ranks of Caribbean pirates. The most significant of these was Mary Read, whose arrival in Nassau during the spring of 1719 would complete the transformation of Rackham's crew into the most innovative and unconventional pirate organization of the Golden Age. Mary Read's path to piracy was even more unconventional than Anne Bonny's. Born in England to an unmarried mother, she had spent much of her childhood disguised as a boy to protect her mother's reputation and secure economic opportunities that were unavailable to women. This early experience of gender disguise had taught her to navigate the male-dominated world of early 18th century society with remarkable skill and confidence. Mary's military experience during the War of Spanish Succession had provided her with the combat training and tactical knowledge that would prove invaluable in her pirate career. Unlike most women of her era, she had learned to handle weapons, participate in organized violence, and function effectively in the disciplined environment of military operations. These skills, combined with her intelligence and natural leadership abilities, made her an ideal candidate for inclusion in Rackham's innovative crew. The meeting between Anne Bonny and Mary Read aboard Rackham's ship created one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of piracy. The two women, despite their very different backgrounds and personalities, formed a close friendship and professional alliance that would make them the most feared fighting team in the Caribbean. Their collaboration demonstrated that women could not only participate in pirate activities, but could excel at them, achieving levels of skill and reputation that rivaled those of the most successful male pirates. The success of Rackham's crew, with its unconventional composition, inspired other pirates to experiment with innovative approaches to crew recruitment and management. The rigid hierarchies that had traditionally governed shipboard life began to give way to more flexible arrangements that emphasized merit and capability over traditional social categories. The result was a gradual transformation in the character of pirate society that made it even more distinct from the conventional world. The period of Calico Jack's greatest success coincided with the intensification of the conflicts that would ultimately destroy Nassau's pirate republic. The innovations that he had pioneered in crew composition and management were overshadowed by the growing violence and instability that characterized the final phase of the Golden Age of Piracy. The democratic ideals that had guided the development of the pirate community were being undermined by the personal ambitions and factional conflicts that had emerged among the pirate leadership. The most serious of these conflicts was the ongoing rivalry between Charles Vane and the established pirate leadership. Vane's brutal approach to piracy had attracted a growing following among the younger and more violent members of the pirate community, creating a faction that was increasingly opposed to the democratic institutions that had made Nassau successful. The tension between this faction and the established leadership was approaching the point where open conflict seemed inevitable. The crisis came to a head during a particularly heated meeting of the Council of Captains in the summer of 1719. The immediate issue was Vane's demand that the Council authorize attacks on British colonial settlements, operations that would represent a significant escalation in the scope of pirate activities. The proposal was opposed by virtually all of the established captains, who recognized that such attacks would provoke a military response that could destroy Nassau entirely. The debate that followed was marked by unprecedented acrimony and personal attacks. Vane accused the established leadership of cowardice and corruption, claiming that they had become too comfortable with their prosperity to take the risks necessary for continued success. The established captains, meanwhile, accused Vane of reckless ambition that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The final vote on Vane's proposal was overwhelmingly negative, but the margin of defeat didn't reflect the true level of support that his faction had achieved within the broader pirate community. Many of the younger pirates, while not represented in the Council of Captains, were sympathetic to Vane's arguments and resentful of what they perceived as the elitist character of Nassau's democratic institutions. The rejection of his proposal by the Council of Captains marked the final break between Charles Vane and Nassau's pirate republic. Within days of the vote, Vane had departed Nassau with his supporters, establishing an independent base of operations that would serve as a rallying point for pirates who opposed the democratic ideals that had guided the Republic's development. The departure of Vane's faction marked the beginning of the end for Nassau's experiment in democratic governance. The period following Vane's departure was marked by increasing instability within Nassau's pirate community. The loss of so many experienced fighters weakened the Republic's military capabilities at a time when external pressures were mounting. The British authorities, encouraged by the apparent divisions within the pirate community, began to consider more aggressive measures to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. The Spanish authorities, meanwhile, had been developing their own response to the pirate threat. The success of the Nassau pirates in capturing Spanish treasure ships and raiding Spanish colonial settlements had convinced the Spanish government that military action was necessary to protect their interests in the Caribbean. Spanish naval forces began to appear in increasing numbers in the waters around the Bahamas, conducting reconnaissance missions and preparing for what appeared to be a major military operation. The growing external pressure on Nassau coincided with internal challenges that tested the pirate republic's democratic institutions to their limits. The departure of Vane's faction had left the remaining pirates with reduced numbers and uncertain morale. The democratic procedures that had governed the community's decision-making process became increasingly cumbersome as the pace of events accelerated and the need for quick decisions became more urgent. The response of Nassau's pirate leadership to these challenges demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of the democratic experiment that they had created. The Council of Captains continued to function, but its deliberations were increasingly influenced by the practical necessities of survival rather than the philosophical ideals that had guided its earlier development. The democratic principles that had made Nassau so attractive to skilled sailors and craftsmen began to give way to more authoritarian arrangements that emphasized military efficiency over popular participation. The transformation of Nassau's pirate society during this period of crisis was gradual but unmistakable. The elaborate democratic procedures that had characterized the Republic's Golden Age were streamlined to permit faster decision-making. The humanitarian principles that had governed the treatment of prisoners and the conduct of operations were relaxed to permit more aggressive tactics. Most significantly, the collective leadership that had made Nassau so stable began to give way to more traditional forms of authority, centered on individual captains and their personal followers. The changes in Nassau's political and social structure were reflected in the character of the operations that the remaining pirates conducted during the final phase of the Republic's existence. The carefully planned multi-ship operations that had characterized the earlier period gave way to smaller, more opportunistic raids that emphasized quick profits over long-term strategic objectives. The humanitarian treatment of prisoners that had been a hallmark of Nassau's pirate society was replaced by more conventional practices that emphasized intimidation and exploitation. The most significant of these late-period operations was a raid against a Spanish treasure convoy that was conducted by a coalition of the remaining Nassau captains in the autumn of 1719. The operation was planned and executed with the professional competence that had made Nassau's pirates so successful. But it lacked the innovative tactics and humanitarian approach that had distinguished the earlier period of the Republic's development. The success of the operation yielded enormous wealth for the participating crews, but it also attracted the kind of attention that the pirates could no longer afford. The Spanish authorities, already planning military action against Nassau, used the raid as justification for accelerating their preparations. The British colonial officials, meanwhile, found themselves under increased pressure from London to take decisive action against the pirate stronghold. The period of Nassau's decline was also marked by the emergence of new pirate leaders who would dominate the final phase of the Golden Age of Piracy. The most significant of these was Bartholomew Roberts, a Welsh sailor whose tactical brilliance and charismatic leadership would make him the most successful pirate of his generation. Roberts's approach to piracy combined elements of all the previous innovations: the democratic ideals of Bellamy, the theatrical spectacle of Blackbeard, the brutal efficiency of Vane, and the innovative crew management of Rackham, while adding his own distinctive elements of discipline and strategic thinking. The arrival of Bartholomew Roberts in the Caribbean during the winter of 1719 marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of piracy, one that would be characterized by increasingly sophisticated operations and growing conflict with the established authorities. Roberts's success would demonstrate that the pirate tradition remained vital and innovative even as the democratic experiment of Nassau approached its inevitable end. The story of Nassau's decline illustrates the complex challenges that faced any attempt to create an alternative society within the imperial framework of the early 18th century Atlantic world. The democratic ideals that had guided the pirate republic's development were undermined not only by external pressure from the established authorities, but also by internal conflicts that reflected the tensions between collective governance and individual ambition that have challenged democratic institutions throughout history. The legacy of Nassau's democratic experiment would endure long after the pirate republic itself had fallen to the forces of conventional authority. The principles of popular participation in government, social mobility based on merit rather than birth, and humanitarian treatment of enemies that had characterized Nassau's Golden Age would inspire future generations of revolutionaries and reformers. The stories of individual pirates who had risen from humble origins to positions of wealth and power would become legends that would capture the imagination of people throughout the world. The final phase of Nassau's existence as an independent pirate republic was approaching, but the innovations and ideals that had made the settlement so remarkable would continue to influence the development of Caribbean piracy and the broader Atlantic world. The democratic experiment that had begun with the gathering of unemployed privateers in a remote Bahamian harbor had created institutions and traditions that would outlast the particular historical circumstances that had given them birth. In the winter of 1719, as Nassau's pirate republic struggled with internal divisions and mounting external pressures, a new figure arrived in the Caribbean whose career would represent both the culmination and the transformation of everything the Golden Age of Piracy had achieved. Bartholomew Roberts, a Welsh sailor in his late 20s, possessed a combination of tactical brilliance, natural leadership, and moral conviction that would make him the most successful and influential pirate of his era. Roberts's path to piracy had been entirely conventional until a moment of brutal chance altered the course of his life forever. He had served as third mate aboard the slave ship Princess, a legitimate merchant vessel engaged in the triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Princess had been captured by the pirate captain Howell Davis near the coast of West Africa, and Roberts found himself faced with the choice that confronted many sailors during the Golden Age of Piracy: join the pirate crew or face an uncertain fate as a prisoner. The decision that Roberts made would transform him from an obscure merchant sailor into one of the most feared and respected pirates in the Atlantic world. Unlike many who chose piracy from desperation or greed, Roberts was motivated by a complex mixture of practical considerations and philosophical convictions that would shape his entire approach to the pirate life. His Welsh background had instilled in him a deep suspicion of English authority and a commitment to the kind of democratic ideals that had flourished in Nassau's pirate republic. The transformation of Bartholomew Roberts from merchant sailor to pirate captain was remarkably swift, reflecting both his natural abilities and the desperate circumstances that faced many pirate crews during this period. Captain Davis, recognizing Roberts's intelligence and leadership potential, quickly promoted him to positions of increasing responsibility within the crew. When Davis was killed during a raid on the West African coast, Roberts was elected by the crew to succeed him as captain, despite having been a pirate for only 6 weeks. The election of Roberts as captain demonstrated the democratic principles that continued to govern pirate crews even as Nassau's larger experiment in democratic governance faced mounting challenges. The crew's decision was based not on Roberts's length of service or his previous achievements, but on their assessment of his character and capabilities. The vote represented a remarkable expression of confidence in a man who had so recently been a legitimate merchant sailor. Roberts's first actions as a pirate captain revealed the strategic thinking and moral conviction that would characterize his entire career. Rather than immediately seeking profit through conventional raids, he organized an expedition to avenge the death of his predecessor. The attack on the settlement where Captain Davis had been killed was conducted with precision and restraint, demonstrating Roberts's commitment to justice while avoiding the kind of indiscriminate violence that had characterized some pirate operations. The success of this expedition established Roberts's reputation among his crew and within the broader pirate community. His approach to piracy combined the tactical sophistication that had made Nassau's pirates so successful with a moral framework that justified their activities in terms of social justice and democratic principles. Roberts articulated a philosophy of piracy that portrayed pirates as agents of social revolution, challenging the established order on behalf of ordinary working people who had been excluded from the benefits of imperial commerce. The moral framework that Roberts developed for his pirate operations was reflected in the detailed code of conduct that he established for his crew. This code, known as Roberts's Articles, represented one of the most sophisticated statements of democratic principles and humanitarian conduct in the history of piracy. The Articles provided for the election of officers, the equitable distribution of booty, and the humane treatment of prisoners, while establishing clear procedures for maintaining discipline and resolving disputes. Roberts's Articles went beyond the practical concerns of ship management to address broader questions of social justice and political philosophy. The code explicitly prohibited the abuse of women and children, mandated fair treatment for captured sailors who chose to join the pirate crew, and established procedures for caring for crew members who were injured in the service of the ship. Most remarkably, the Articles included provisions for the democratic governance of the crew that were more advanced than the political systems of most contemporary societies. The implementation of Roberts's Articles created a floating republic that embodied the democratic ideals that had inspired Nassau's pirate community at its best. The crew participated directly in major decisions through councils and votes, while officers served at the pleasure of the common sailors rather than through appointment by higher authority. The result was a remarkably egalitarian society that provided opportunities for advancement and participation that were unavailable in the conventional world. The success of Roberts's democratic approach to piracy was demonstrated by the loyalty and effectiveness of his crew. Unlike many pirate captains who struggled to maintain discipline and prevent desertion, Roberts commanded the genuine respect and affection of his followers. The crew of his flagship, the Royal Fortune, became one of the most feared and efficient fighting forces in the Atlantic, capable of capturing vessels and conducting operations that would have been impossible for less cohesive organizations. The tactical innovations that Roberts introduced to pirate warfare reflected his understanding of the changing strategic environment that faced Caribbean pirates in the late period of the Golden Age. The increased naval activity by European powers and the growing cooperation between colonial authorities had made the large-scale operations that had characterized Nassau's heyday increasingly difficult and dangerous. Roberts responded by developing new tactics that emphasized mobility, intelligence, and surprise over the direct confrontation that had been possible during the earlier period. The most significant of these innovations was Roberts's development of a multi-ship fleet that could operate across vast areas of the Atlantic simultaneously. Unlike previous pirate commanders who had concentrated their forces in single powerful vessels, Roberts dispersed his fleet across multiple ships that could coordinate their activities while maintaining the flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. This approach allowed him to conduct operations from the Caribbean to the coast of West Africa, creating a maritime empire that spanned thousands of miles of ocean. The geographic scope of Roberts's operations was unprecedented in the history of piracy. His fleet conducted successful raids in the Caribbean, off the coast of North America, and along the West African coast, demonstrating a level of strategic planning and logistical capability that had never before been achieved by pirate organizations. The success of these far-flung operations established Roberts as the most powerful pirate of his generation and demonstrated the continuing vitality of the pirate tradition even as Nassau's experiment in democratic governance approached its end. The most spectacular of Roberts's operations was his capture of an entire Portuguese fleet in the harbor of Bahia, Brazil, an exploit that demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his commitment to the democratic principles that governed his crew. The operation required careful planning and precise execution, as Roberts's relatively small force attacked a much larger fleet in a heavily defended harbor. The success of the attack yielded enormous wealth for the pirate crew, while establishing Roberts's reputation as the most formidable pirate commander of his era. The psychological impact of the Bahia raid extended far beyond its immediate material results. The capture of an entire fleet in a major colonial harbor demonstrated that even the most powerful European empires remained vulnerable to pirate attack. The success of the operation inspired other pirates while causing alarm among colonial authorities throughout the Atlantic world. The raid marked the climax of Roberts's career and established him as the successor to the legendary pirates who had dominated the earlier period of the Golden Age. The period of Roberts's greatest success coincided with the final collapse of Nassau's pirate republic. The democratic experiment that had made Nassau so remarkable was finally destroyed by a combination of external pressure and internal divisions that overwhelmed the community's ability to maintain its independence. The arrival of British naval forces in 1720, combined with the ongoing factional conflicts that had weakened the pirate community, brought an end to one of the most significant political experiments of the early modern period. The fall of Nassau marked the end of an era in the history of Caribbean piracy, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in which individual pirate commanders like Roberts would carry forward the democratic ideals and innovative tactics that had made the pirate republic so successful. The dispersal of Nassau's pirate community spread these innovations throughout the Atlantic world, influencing the development of piracy in regions far from the Caribbean. Roberts's response to the fall of Nassau demonstrated his understanding of the changing strategic environment that faced Caribbean pirates in the post-Nassau period. Rather than attempting to establish a new pirate stronghold that would inevitably attract the attention of the authorities, he adopted a nomadic approach that emphasized constant movement and dispersed operations. This strategy allowed him to maintain his fleet's effectiveness while avoiding the kind of concentration that had made Nassau vulnerable to military attack. The nomadic strategy that Roberts adopted was facilitated by the network of support and supply that had been developed during Nassau's Golden Age. The informal economy that connected pirate crews to colonial merchants and officials continued to function even after the destruction of the Pirate Republic, providing Roberts and other surviving pirates with the resources they needed to continue their operations. The legacy of Nassau's commercial relationships proved to be one of the most enduring aspects of the Pirate Republic's influence on the Atlantic world. The moral framework that Roberts had developed for his pirate operations became increasingly important as the strategic environment became more challenging. The commitment to democratic governance and humanitarian conduct that characterized his crew provided a source of legitimacy and morale that was essential for maintaining effectiveness in the face of mounting opposition. The crew's belief that they were fighting for justice rather than mere profit gave them the motivation necessary to continue their resistance against overwhelming odds. The success of Roberts's approach inspired other pirate commanders to adopt similar tactics and principles. The democratic governance and humanitarian conduct that he had pioneered became standard practices among the most successful pirate crews of the late Golden Age. The result was a transformation in the character of Atlantic piracy that made it more disciplined, more effective, and more morally defensible than it had ever been before. The influence of Roberts's innovations extended beyond the immediate pirate community to affect the broader development of maritime culture in the Atlantic world. The democratic principles that governed his crew inspired similar experiments among legitimate merchant sailors, while the tactical innovations that he had developed were studied and adopted by naval commanders on both sides of the law. The legacy of his achievements would endure long after his own career had ended. The period of Roberts's dominance in Atlantic piracy was also marked by the emergence of new challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The European powers, alarmed by the success of his operations, began to coordinate their anti-piracy efforts more effectively. The development of new naval technologies and tactics made it increasingly difficult for pirate vessels to escape pursuit and capture. Most significantly, the economic changes that were transforming the Atlantic world were reducing the opportunities for profitable piracy while increasing the resources available for suppression efforts. The changing economic environment that faced Atlantic pirates in the 1720s reflected broader transformations in the imperial systems that governed colonial commerce. The consolidation of European control over colonial territories, the development of more efficient administrative systems, and the growth of naval forces dedicated to protecting commercial shipping all contributed to a strategic environment that was increasingly hostile to pirate operations. Roberts's response to these challenges demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that had made him such a successful pirate commander. He recognized that the Golden Age of Piracy was approaching its end, but he was determined to ensure that the democratic ideals and humanitarian principles that had guided his career would survive the inevitable suppression of pirate activities. His final operations were conducted not merely for profit, but as demonstrations of the continuing vitality of the pirate tradition and the enduring appeal of the democratic alternatives that pirates had created to the hierarchical structures of conventional society. The last phase of Roberts's career was marked by increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his fleet's effectiveness in the face of mounting opposition. The naval forces that pursued him were better equipped and more numerous than any that had previously been deployed against pirates. The colonial authorities had learned from their earlier failures and were now coordinating their efforts more effectively. Most significantly, the informal network of support and supply that had sustained pirate operations was being systematically destroyed by the authorities. The final confrontation between Roberts and the forces of conventional authority came off the coast of West Africa in February 1722. The battle that ended his career was fought with the kind of tactical brilliance and moral courage that had characterized his entire approach to piracy. Even in defeat, Roberts demonstrated the democratic principles that had guided his leadership, consulting with his crew until the final moments, and ensuring that his followers understood the larger significance of their struggle. The death of Bartholomew Roberts marked the end of the Golden Age of Piracy in the Atlantic world. His career had demonstrated that the democratic ideals and innovative tactics that had emerged from Nassau's pirate republic could survive the destruction of the republic itself. But it had also revealed the ultimate limitations that faced any attempt to maintain an alternative society within the imperial framework of the early modern Atlantic world. The legacy of Roberts's achievements extended far beyond the immediate context of Caribbean piracy to influence the broader development of democratic thought and practice in the Atlantic world. The principles of popular governance, social equality, and humanitarian conduct that had characterized his crew became part of the intellectual heritage that would inspire future generations of revolutionaries and reformers. The stories of his exploits became legends that would capture the imagination of people throughout the world, providing a powerful symbol of resistance to arbitrary authority and social injustice. The transformation of Roberts from obscure merchant sailor to legendary pirate commander illustrated the opportunities for social mobility and personal advancement that the pirate life had offered to ordinary working people. His career demonstrated that merit and character could triumph over birth and privilege in a world that was otherwise dominated by rigid social hierarchies. The democratic institutions that he had created aboard his ships provided a practical example of how alternative forms of social organization might function. The moral framework that Roberts had developed for his pirate operations represented one of the most sophisticated attempts to justify revolutionary violence in terms of social justice and democratic principles. His argument that pirates were agents of social revolution fighting against an unjust system would be echoed by later generations of political revolutionaries who faced similar challenges in attempting to create more equitable societies. The tactical innovations that Roberts had introduced to pirate warfare would also have lasting influence on the development of naval strategy and maritime culture. his emphasis on mobility, intelligence, and coordination would be adopted by both legitimate naval forces and future generations of irregular maritime fighters. The multi-ship fleet structure that he had pioneered would become a standard feature of naval operations in the Age of Sail. The story of Bartholomew Roberts represented both the culmination of the Golden Age of Piracy and the beginning of its transformation into legend and memory. His career embodied all the contradictions and achievements that had made the Pirate Republic of Nassau so remarkable. The tension between democratic ideals and violent methods, the conflict between individual ambition and collective governance, and the ultimate impossibility of maintaining an alternative society within the imperial framework of the early modern world. The end of Roberts's career marked not only the conclusion of the Golden Age of Piracy, but also the beginning of the process by which the historical reality of pirate society would be transformed into the romantic legends that would capture the popular imagination for centuries to come. The democratic experiments and humanitarian principles that had characterized the best of pirate society would be largely forgotten, while the dramatic adventures and colorful personalities of individual pirates would become the stuff of popular entertainment and cultural mythology. The autumn of 1720 brought ominous changes to the waters around Nassau, as British warships appeared with increasing frequency on the horizon, their presence a constant reminder that the golden age of the Pirate Republic was drawing to its close. The man responsible for this transformation was Captain Woodes Rogers, a former privateer whose own experiences during the War of Spanish Succession had given him intimate knowledge of the tactics and psychology that made pirates so effective. Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor on a sweltering July morning aboard the HMS Delicia, accompanied by a small fleet of warships and transport vessels carrying soldiers, supplies, and the royal commission that would make him the first legitimate governor of the Bahamas in over a decade. His mission was clear: to transform Nassau from a pirate stronghold into a respectable British colonial settlement, using whatever combination of diplomacy, bribery, and force might prove necessary. The appointment of Rogers as governor represented a fundamental shift in British policy toward Caribbean piracy. The previous approach of benign neglect, combined with occasional ineffective military expeditions, had clearly failed to address the growing threat that Nassau represented to British commercial interests. The success of the Pirate Republic in coordinating large-scale operations against Spanish shipping had demonstrated that pirates could no longer be dismissed as a minor irritation that could be safely ignored. Rogers himself embodied the complex relationship between legitimate privateering and illegal piracy that had characterized the post-war Caribbean. His own career had included highly successful privateering expeditions that had yielded enormous profits while serving British strategic interests. His circumnavigation of the globe between 1708 and 1711 had made him famous throughout the English-speaking world, while his capture of Spanish treasure ships had provided him with the wealth and connections necessary to secure his appointment as governor. The irony of Rogers' appointment wasn't lost on the pirates of Nassau, many of whom had served under his command during the recent war. The man who now arrived to suppress their activities had been instrumental in teaching them the skills and tactics that had made them so successful. The situation highlighted the arbitrary nature of the distinction between legal and illegal maritime violence that had shaped the development of Caribbean society during the early 18th century. Roger's first actions as governor demonstrated his understanding of the complex challenge that faced him in transforming Nassau from a pirate stronghold into a legitimate colonial settlement. Rather than immediately resorting to military force, he offered a general amnesty to any pirate who would surrender voluntarily and accept a royal pardon. The offer was accompanied by promises of employment in legitimate maritime activities and protection from prosecution for past offences. The amnesty proclamation that Rogers issued upon his arrival in Nassau was carefully crafted to appeal to the practical concerns and moral sensibilities of the pirate community. The document acknowledged the economic hardships that had driven many men to piracy, while offering concrete alternatives that would allow them to support themselves and their families through legitimate means. Most importantly, the amnesty provided a face-saving mechanism that would allow pirates to abandon their illegal activities without appearing to surrender to superior force. The response of Nassau's pirate community to Rogers's amnesty offer revealed the deep divisions that had developed within the Republic during its final years. The pragmatic faction, led by captains like Benjamin Hornigold, who had been instrumental in establishing Nassau's democratic institutions, was inclined to accept the amnesty and attempt to negotiate a peaceful transition to legitimate colonial status. These men recognized that the strategic environment had changed in ways that made continued resistance increasingly futile. The opposition to Roger's amnesty was led by the more radical elements of the pirate community, men who viewed any accommodation with British authority as a betrayal of the democratic principles that had made Nassau so remarkable. These pirates argued that acceptance of the amnesty would legitimize the imperial system that they had spent years fighting, reducing them to the status of subjects rather than the free citizens they had become through their own efforts. The debate over Roger's amnesty offer took place in the same taverns and meeting halls where the pirates had previously debated questions of strategy and philosophy. The discussions revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had developed within the pirate community, as well as the genuine commitment to democratic ideals that had guided many of their activities. The fundamental question was whether the pirate republic could maintain its independence and continue to offer an alternative to the hierarchical structures of conventional colonial society. The decision-making process that followed Roger's arrival demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of Nassau's democratic institutions. The Council of Captains met in extended session with representatives from every active pirate crew participating in debates that continued for several days. The discussions were marked by passionate speeches and careful analysis of the strategic situation facing the pirate community. The final vote on whether to accept Roger's amnesty was closer than many had expected, reflecting the genuine uncertainty that existed within the pirate community about the best course of action. The pragmatic faction ultimately prevailed, but the margin of victory was narrow enough to demonstrate the continued strength of the radical opposition. The decision to negotiate with Rogers represented a fundamental transformation in the character of Nassau's pirate republic. The negotiations between Rogers and the pirate representatives were conducted with a formality and sophistication that surprised many observers. The pirates approached the discussions as equals rather than as defeated criminals seeking mercy, insisting on their right to negotiate terms that would protect their interests and preserve their dignity. Rogers, recognizing the military and political realities that he faced, was willing to treat the pirate leaders as legitimate representatives of a functioning government. The agreement that emerged from these negotiations represented a remarkable compromise between the demands of imperial authority and the democratic principles that had guided Nassau's development. The pirates who accepted the amnesty would be granted full pardons for their past activities and would be eligible for employment in the colonial administration or the Royal Navy. In return, they would renounce piracy and accept the authority of the British Crown. The implementation of the amnesty agreement proved to be more complex than either side had anticipated. Many pirates were genuinely eager to return to legitimate activities, but they faced practical difficulties in making the transition from the freewheeling life of the pirate republic to the structured existence of colonial society. The skills that had made them successful pirates didn't always translate easily to legitimate employment, while their democratic expectations often conflicted with the hierarchical structures of conventional institutions. Rogers demonstrated considerable skill in managing the transition process, recognizing that the success of his mission depended on his ability to integrate former pirates into colonial society rather than simply suppressing their activities. He appointed several former pirate captains to positions of responsibility within the colonial administration, acknowledging their leadership abilities while providing them with legitimate channels for their ambitions. The most significant of these appointments was the naming of Benjamin Hornigold as a captain in the Bahamian colonial navy, with responsibility for suppressing the remaining pirate activities in the region. The appointment was controversial among both former pirates and legitimate colonial officials, but it demonstrated Rogers' understanding of the practical necessities that faced his administration. Hornigold's knowledge of pirate tactics and his relationships within the maritime community made him uniquely qualified to perform this role. The transformation of Hornigold from pirate captain to colonial naval officer illustrated the complex process by which Nassau's former pirates were integrated into legitimate colonial society. The democratic ideals that had guided his activities as a pirate were not entirely abandoned, but were channeled into more conventional forms of public service. His new role allowed him to continue exercising leadership and protecting the interests of ordinary sailors, albeit within the framework of imperial authority. The success of Rogers' amnesty program was not universal, however. A significant minority of Nassau's pirate community rejected the offer of pardons and chose to continue their resistance to British authority. These holdouts included some of the most notorious pirates of the Golden Age, men whose commitment to the pirate life went beyond mere economic calculation to encompass genuine philosophical opposition to the imperial system. Charles Vane emerged as the leader of this resistance movement, using his reputation for violence and his network of supporters among the younger pirates to organize continued opposition to Rogers' administration. Vane's rejection of the amnesty was based not only on his personal ambitions, but also on his belief that any accommodation with British authority would destroy the freedom and independence that had made the pirate life so attractive. The departure of Vane and his followers from Nassau marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between pirates and imperial authority. These holdout pirates no longer enjoyed the protection and support infrastructure that had made Nassau such an effective base of operations. Instead, they were forced to adopt a more nomadic existence, constantly moving between temporary bases while avoiding the naval patrols that Rogers had organized to hunt them down. The strategy that Vane adopted in his resistance to Rogers' administration demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of the pirate tradition in its final phase. His emphasis on mobility and surprise allowed him to conduct successful raids against merchant shipping while avoiding direct confrontation with superior naval forces. However, the loss of Nassau's support infrastructure meant that his operations were necessarily smaller in scale and less coordinated than those of the Golden Age. The most dramatic confrontation between Vane and Rogers' administration came in the form of a raid on Nassau itself, an audacious attack that demonstrated both Vane's tactical skill and his commitment to the pirate cause. The raid was planned and executed with the precision that had characterized the best pirate operations, but its psychological impact was even more significant than its material results. The attack on Nassau took place on a moonless night in October 1720, when Vane's fleet approached the harbor under cover of darkness and launched a coordinated assault on the ships anchored there. The raiders succeeded in capturing several vessels and destroying others before withdrawing to the open sea. But the real significance of the operation lay in its demonstration that the pirate tradition remained vital and dangerous despite Rogers' apparent success in pacifying the region. The psychological impact of Vane's raid on Nassau was enormous, both within the pirate community and among the colonial authorities. For the former pirates who had accepted Rogers' amnesty, the attack served as a reminder of the excitement and freedom they had given up in exchange for security and legitimacy. For Rogers and his administration, the raid demonstrated that the pirate threat had not been eliminated, but had merely changed its character. The response to Vane's raid revealed the complex loyalties and divided sympathies that characterized Nassau in the aftermath of Rogers' arrival. While few of the former pirates actively supported Vane's attack, many were clearly sympathetic to his cause and resentful of the constraints that colonial society imposed on their activities. The colonial authorities, meanwhile, found themselves dependent on former pirates for intelligence and assistance in combating the continuing threat. The campaign that Rogers organized to hunt down Vane and his followers demonstrated the resources and determination that the British Empire was now willing to commit to the suppression of Caribbean piracy. The naval forces at Rogers' disposal were larger and better equipped than any that had previously been used against pirates, while the intelligence network that he developed provided detailed information about pirate movements and activities. The pursuit of Charles Vane became a symbol of the broader conflict between the pirate tradition and imperial authority that was playing out throughout the Caribbean during this period. Vane's ability to evade capture, despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against him, demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of pirate tactics, while Rogers' determination to bring him to justice illustrated the British commitment to eliminating piracy as a threat to colonial commerce. The final confrontation between Vane and Rogers' forces came after months of pursuit that had ranged across the Caribbean and along the North American coast. Vane's capture was the result not of superior force, but of betrayal by former associates who had grown weary of the constant danger and uncertain prospects that the pirate life now offered. The circumstances of his capture illustrated the isolation that had come to characterize the final generation of Caribbean pirates. The trial and execution of Charles Vane in Jamaica marked the symbolic end of Nassau's experiment in pirate democracy. The formal legal proceedings that preceded his death were designed to demonstrate the triumph of law and order over the chaos and violence that the authorities associated with pirate rule. However, the dignity and defiance that Vane displayed during his trial also served to enhance the legend of pirate resistance to imperial authority. The period following Vane's execution was marked by the systematic elimination of the remaining pirates who had rejected Rogers' amnesty. The campaign that accomplished this goal was notable for its coordination between different colonial administrations and its use of former pirates as agents of suppression. The transformation of men like Benjamin Hornigold from pirate leaders to pirate hunters illustrated the complex process by which the pirate tradition was brought to an end. The final major pirate trial of the Golden Age involved Calico Jack Rackham and his crew, including Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose capture off the coast of Jamaica in November 1720 marked the end of the most innovative experiment in pirate crew composition. The trial that followed their capture attracted international attention, both because of the unusual circumstances of their case and because of the larger questions it raised about the role of women in maritime society. The testimony that emerged during the trial of Rackham's crew provided detailed insights into the daily life and social organization of pirate vessels during the final phase of the Golden Age. The accounts of Anne Bonny and Mary Read's participation in pirate operations challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles while demonstrating the egalitarian principles that had characterized the best aspects of pirate society. The sentences that were imposed on Rackham and his crew reflected both the determination of the authorities to eliminate piracy and their recognition of the unusual circumstances that had characterized this particular case. Rackham himself was executed, but Anne Bonny and Mary Read were spared because of their pregnancies, a decision that illustrated the complex intersection of legal, moral, and practical considerations that influenced the treatment of captured pirates. The execution of Calico Jack and the imprisonment of his female crew members marked the effective end of the Caribbean phase of the Golden Age of Piracy. The systematic campaign that Rogers and other colonial administrators had conducted had succeeded in eliminating piracy as an organized threat to colonial commerce, while the amnesty programs had provided alternative opportunities for most former pirates. The transformation of Nassau from pirate stronghold to legitimate colonial settlement was completed during the years that followed Rogers' arrival. The democratic institutions that had made the pirate republic so remarkable were replaced by the conventional hierarchical structures of colonial administration. The entrepreneurial energy that had driven the pirate economy was channeled into legitimate commercial activities that served imperial rather than local interests. The physical transformation of Nassau during this period was as dramatic as its political and economic changes. The fortifications that had protected the pirate republic were strengthened and expanded to serve the needs of colonial defense. The harbor facilities that had supported the pirate fleet were modified to accommodate legitimate commercial shipping. Most symbolically, the taverns and meeting halls where pirates had debated questions of democracy and social justice were converted to serve the needs of a conventional colonial society. The success of Rogers' mission in transforming Nassau demonstrated that the imperial authorities had learned important lessons from their earlier failures in dealing with Caribbean piracy. The combination of military force, economic incentives, and political accommodation that Rogers employed proved to be far more effective than the purely military approaches that had been tried previously. The success of this strategy would serve as a model for later efforts to suppress irregular maritime activities throughout the Atlantic world. The integration of former pirates into colonial society was not without its challenges and contradictions. Many of the men who had been leaders in the Democratic Republic found it difficult to adjust to the hierarchical structures of colonial administration. The skills that had made them successful pirates did not always translate easily to legitimate employment, while their democratic expectations often conflicted with the authoritarian character of imperial governance. The women who had participated in pirate activities faced particular difficulties in making the transition to legitimate colonial society. The opportunities for independence and equality that had characterized their experience in the pirate community were not available in conventional society, where gender roles were much more rigidly defined and enforced. The cases of Anne Bonny and Mary Read illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations that the pirate tradition had offered to women seeking alternatives to conventional social arrangements. The economic transformation of Nassau from pirate stronghold to colonial settlement had broader implications for the development of the Caribbean economy. The wealth that had been accumulated through piracy was gradually integrated into legitimate commercial networks, while the entrepreneurial skills that pirates had developed were applied to conventional business activities. The result was a period of economic growth that benefited both former pirates and the broader colonial community. The cultural legacy of Nassau's pirate republic proved to be more enduring than its political and economic institutions. The stories and legends that had grown up around the pirate community continued to circulate long after the republic itself had been destroyed, influencing popular perceptions of piracy and democratic governance throughout the Atlantic world. The democratic ideals that had guided the pirate community became part of the intellectual heritage that would inspire future generations of political reformers. The suppression of Caribbean piracy during the 1720s marked the end of one of the most remarkable experiments in democratic governance in the early modern world. The Pirate Republic of Nassau had demonstrated that ordinary working people could create effective institutions of self-government when freed from the constraints of conventional authority. The success of these institutions had challenged the assumptions about human nature and political capacity that justified the hierarchical structures of imperial society. The methods that were used to destroy the Pirate Republic also demonstrated the resources and determination that the imperial authorities were willing to commit to the preservation of their dominance. The campaign against Caribbean piracy had required unprecedented coordination between different colonial administrations and the deployment of military and naval resources on a scale that had never before been seen in the region. The success of this campaign illustrated the growing strength and sophistication of imperial governance during the early 18th century. The transformation of former pirates into agents of imperial authority represented one of the most significant aspects of the campaign against Caribbean piracy. The appointment of men like Benjamin Hornigold to positions of responsibility within the colonial administration demonstrated the practical necessities that faced imperial authorities in regions where conventional forms of governance had limited effectiveness. The success of these appointments also illustrated the adaptability and skill that had characterized the pirate leadership. The end of Nassau's Pirate Republic marked not only the conclusion of the Golden Age of Caribbean piracy, but also the beginning of a new phase in the development of Atlantic maritime culture. The democratic ideals and innovative practices that had characterized pirate society would continue to influence the development of maritime communities throughout the Atlantic world, even as the organized pirate threat disappeared. The legacy of Nassau's democratic experiment would prove to be one of the most enduring aspects of the Golden Age of piracy. The principles of popular governance, social equality, and individual liberty that had guided the pirate community would inspire future generations of political revolutionaries and social reformers. The stories of ordinary sailors who had risen to positions of leadership and influence would become symbols of the possibilities for social mobility and democratic participation that could exist when conventional hierarchies were challenged. The suppression of Caribbean piracy also marked an important turning point in the development of imperial governance and maritime law. The success of the campaign against the pirates demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated international efforts to suppress irregular maritime activities, while the legal proceedings that followed the capture of pirate crews established important precedents for the treatment of maritime criminals. These developments would influence the evolution of international law and naval warfare for generations to come. The story of Nassau's rise and fall illustrated the complex relationship between democratic ideals and practical governance that has characterized political experiments throughout history. The Pirate Republic had demonstrated that ordinary people could create effective institutions of self-government, but it had also revealed the limitations that faced any attempt to maintain an alternative society within the framework of a larger imperial system. The ultimate failure of the Pirate Republic did not negate the significance of its achievements, but it did demonstrate the challenges that faced democratic movements in an era dominated by imperial authority. The decade that followed the suppression of Nassau's Pirate Republic witnessed a remarkable transformation in the popular memory and cultural significance of the Golden Age of Piracy. As the immediate threat of organized piracy faded from the Caribbean, the stories and legends of the pirate community began to take on new meanings that would influence popular culture and political thought for centuries to come. The process by which historical reality was transformed into cultural legend began almost immediately after the execution of the last pirate leaders. The newspapers and pamphlets that circulated throughout the British Atlantic world carried sensationalized accounts of pirate trials and executions that emphasized the dramatic and exotic aspects of pirate life while largely ignoring the political and social innovations that had made Nassau so remarkable. The most influential of these early accounts was Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in London in 1724. Johnson's work, which may have been written by Daniel Defoe, provided detailed biographical accounts of the major pirate leaders while creating a narrative framework that would shape popular perceptions of piracy for generations. The book's emphasis on individual adventure and romantic rebellion obscured the collective achievements and democratic innovations of the pirate community. The transformation of pirate history into popular entertainment reflected broader changes in the cultural and intellectual climate of the early 18th century. The growing emphasis on individual achievement and romantic rebellion that characterized the emerging culture of sensibility found perfect expression in the stories of pirate adventures. The democratic ideals and collective institutions that had actually guided pirate society were less compatible with these cultural trends and were consequently marginalized in popular accounts. The romanticization of piracy during this period also reflected the changing strategic environment that had made organized piracy increasingly difficult to sustain. As the threat of actual piracy diminished, it became possible to view the pirate tradition as a source of entertainment rather than a challenge to established authority. The transformation of pirates from dangerous enemies into romantic heroes was facilitated by the removal of any real threat they might pose to the existing order. The cultural legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was not limited to popular entertainment, but also influenced serious political and philosophical thought during the Enlightenment. The democratic experiments that had characterized pirate society provided empirical evidence for theories about the natural capacity of human beings for self-government. Philosophers like Rousseau and later democratic theorists would draw on accounts of pirate democracy to support their arguments about the artificial character of social hierarchies. The influence of pirate democracy on Enlightenment political thought was particularly evident in discussions of the social contract and the origins of political authority. The voluntary associations that had characterized pirate crews provided examples of how free individuals might come together to create political institutions based on consent rather than force. The success of these associations demonstrated that democratic governance was not merely a theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that had been achieved by ordinary working people. The economic innovations that had characterized pirate society also influenced the development of commercial and financial institutions during the 18th century. The profit-sharing arrangements that had governed pirate crews anticipated later developments in corporate organization, while the insurance and credit systems that had supported pirate operations provided models for legitimate commercial practices. The entrepreneurial energy that had driven the pirate economy was gradually absorbed into the expanding Atlantic commercial system. The role of women in pirate society became a particular focus of cultural fascination during the decades following the Golden Age. The stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles while providing inspiration for later generations of women seeking expanded opportunities for independence and achievement. The fact that these women had succeeded in one of the most male-dominated environments of their era demonstrated the artificial character of many gender restrictions. The treatment of Anne Bonny and Mary Read in popular accounts revealed the complex intersection of gender, class, and cultural expectations that influenced how their stories were told and remembered. Their achievements as pirates were often overshadowed by romantic speculation about their personal relationships, while their political and military accomplishments were minimized in favor of emphasis on their supposed feminine characteristics. The cultural transformation of pirate history during the 18th century was also influenced by the broader process of imperial consolidation that was taking place throughout the Atlantic world. As European empires became more secure and more systematically organized, the threat that piracy had posed to imperial authority was gradually forgotten. The transformation of pirates from dangerous enemies into romantic figures was part of a larger process by which imperial societies dealt with the memory of successful resistance to their authority. The geographic expansion of European empires during the 18th century also contributed to the cultural transformation of pirate history. As imperial attention shifted to new frontiers in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, the Caribbean ceased to be the crucial strategic arena that it had been during the Golden Age of Piracy. The reduced strategic importance of the region made it easier to romanticize the pirate tradition without appearing to challenge contemporary imperial interests. The influence of pirate legends on popular culture was not limited to literature and entertainment, but also affected the development of maritime traditions and professional practices. The democratic ideals that had characterized pirate crews influenced the evolution of sailors' organizations and mutual aid societies, while the tactical innovations that pirates had developed continued to be studied and applied by naval commanders. The legacy of pirate seamanship and navigation techniques was preserved in the maritime traditions that were passed down through generations of professional sailors. The legal precedents that had been established during the suppression of Caribbean piracy also had lasting influence on the development of maritime law and international legal principles. The trials of pirate leaders had clarified questions about jurisdiction, extradition, and the treatment of maritime criminals that would remain relevant for centuries. The legal frameworks that had been developed to deal with piracy would later be applied to other forms of irregular maritime activity. The economic impact of the Golden Age of Piracy extended far beyond the immediate period of pirate activity. The wealth that had been accumulated through piracy was gradually integrated into legitimate commercial networks, contributing to the capitalization of various industries and enterprises throughout the Atlantic world. The entrepreneurial skills that former pirates had developed were applied to legitimate business activities, contributing to the commercial expansion of the 18th century. The demographic impact of the pirate suppression campaign was also significant for the development of maritime communities throughout the Atlantic. The integration of former pirates into colonial societies provided these communities with experienced sailors and craftsmen who contributed to their economic and cultural development. The skills and knowledge that these men brought with them helped to improve navigation, shipbuilding, and maritime commerce in their new homes. The intellectual legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was perhaps most evident in the development of democratic political theory during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The success of pirate democratic institutions provided empirical evidence that challenged traditional justifications for hierarchical political systems. The fact that ordinary sailors had been able to create effective institutions of self-government demonstrated the artificial character of many class-based restrictions on political participation. The influence of pirate democratic theory was particularly evident during the American Revolution, when colonial leaders drew on various traditions of resistance to imperial authority in justifying their rebellion against British rule. While pirate democracy was not explicitly cited by revolutionary leaders, the principles of a popular sovereignty and consensual government that had characterized pirate society were clearly reflected in revolutionary political theory. The cultural memory of the Golden Age of Piracy also played an important role in the development of national identities in various parts of the Atlantic world. In the Caribbean, the pirate tradition became part of a broader narrative of resistance to imperial authority that would influence later independence movements. In North America, pirate legends contributed to the development of a distinctly American maritime tradition that emphasized individual freedom and democratic values. The transformation of pirate history into cultural legend was not without its costs and distortions. The emphasis on individual adventure and romantic rebellion that characterized popular accounts often obscured the collective achievements and democratic innovations that had made pirate society so remarkable. The focus on dramatic episodes and colorful personalities drew attention away from the broader political and social significance of the pirate experience. The romanticization of piracy also contributed to the development of cultural attitudes that glorified violence and lawlessness while ignoring the humanitarian principles that had actually governed the best pirate communities. The popular image of pirates as lawless adventurers who rejected all social constraints was fundamentally inconsistent with the historical reality of pirate society, which had been characterized by elaborate codes of conduct and sophisticated democratic institutions. The gender dynamics of pirate legends also reflected and reinforced contemporary assumptions about the proper roles of men and women in society. The stories of female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were often told in ways that emphasized their supposed deviation from feminine norms rather than their achievements as leaders and fighters. This treatment obscured the genuine innovations in gender relations that had characterized some pirate communities. The racial dimensions of pirate society were also subject to distortion and misrepresentation in popular accounts. The relatively egalitarian treatment of sailors from different racial backgrounds that had characterized some pirate crews was often ignored in favor of conventional racial stereotypes. The complex relationships between pirates and the various ethnic communities of the Caribbean were simplified into dramatic narratives that reinforced rather than challenged prevailing racial assumptions. Despite these distortions and limitations, the cultural legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy continued to provide inspiration for later generations of political and social reformers. The democratic ideals that had guided pirate society, even when imperfectly remembered and understood, offered a powerful alternative to the hierarchical structures that dominated most contemporary societies. The success of pirate democratic institutions demonstrated that ordinary people possessed the capacity for self-government and collective action that elite theorists often denied. The economic innovations that had characterized pirate society also continued to influence the development of commercial and financial institutions. The profit-sharing arrangements that had governed pirate crews anticipated later developments in worker ownership and cooperative enterprise, while the insurance and credit systems that had supported pirate operations provided models for legitimate commercial practices. The tactical and technological innovations that pirates had developed in their maritime operations continued to influence naval warfare and commercial shipping for generations. The emphasis on speed, maneuverability, and psychological warfare that had characterized pirate tactics was gradually incorporated into conventional naval doctrine, while the modifications that pirates had made to their vessels influenced the development of ship design and construction techniques. The cultural transformation of pirate history during the 18th and 19th centuries was part of a broader process by which imperial societies dealt with the memory of successful resistance to their authority. The romanticization of piracy made it possible to acknowledge and even celebrate the achievements of the pirate community while neutralizing any challenge they might pose to contemporary political arrangements. The transformation of pirates from dangerous enemies into harmless romantic figures was an essential part of this process. The legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy thus became a complex mixture of historical memory, cultural legend, and political inspiration that would continue to influence Atlantic societies for centuries to come. The democratic ideals and innovative practices that had characterized pirate society would survive in various forms, inspiring later generations of reformers and revolutionaries, while also providing material for popular entertainment and cultural expression. The story of how historical reality was transformed into cultural legend illustrates the complex relationship between memory and all that has characterized all societies throughout history. The suppression of the pirate republic had eliminated the immediate threat that it posed to imperial authority, but the cultural memory of pirate achievements continued to provide inspiration for those who sought alternatives to the established order. The ultimate significance of the Golden Age of Piracy lay not in the temporary success of the pirate republic, but in the enduring legacy of its democratic innovations and humanitarian principles. The fact that ordinary sailors had been able to create effective institutions of self-government and develop sophisticated systems of collective decision-making provided powerful evidence for the capacity of human beings to govern themselves when freed from the constraints of artificial hierarchies. The cultural transformation of this legacy during the centuries that followed would ensure that the democratic ideals and innovative practices that had characterized pirate society would continue to influence political thought and social development throughout the Atlantic world and beyond. The story of Nassau's pirate republic had become part of the larger narrative of human struggle for freedom, equality, and self-determination that would shape the modern world. The sun set slowly over Nassau Harbour on a calm evening in 1730, its golden light reflecting off waters that had once been crowded with the ships of the most remarkable maritime republic in history. A decade had passed since Woodes Rogers had transformed the settlement from a pirate stronghold into a respectable British colonial outpost, and the physical traces of the democratic experiment that had flourished here were rapidly disappearing beneath the structures of conventional imperial governance. The fort that had once protected the pirate republic now flew the British flag, its guns pointed outward toward potential enemies, rather than inward toward the community it had once served. The taverns where pirates had debated questions of democracy and social justice had been converted to serve the needs of colonial merchants and administrators. The harbour that had sheltered vessels flying the black flag now accommodated the merchant ships and naval vessels that served the interests of the British Empire. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent transformation, the legacy of Nassau's Golden Age continued to flow like an underground river, influencing the development of Atlantic societies in ways that the imperial authorities could neither control nor fully understand. The men who had created the pirate republic had dispersed throughout the Caribbean and beyond, carrying with them the democratic ideals and innovative practices that had made their experiment so remarkable. Former pirate captains who had accepted Rogers' amnesty found themselves serving in positions of responsibility throughout the British colonial system. Benjamin Hornigold commanded vessels in the colonial navy, using his knowledge of pirate tactics to suppress the remaining irregular maritime activities, while quietly preserving some of the democratic traditions that had characterized his earlier career. Other former pirates established themselves as merchants, craftsmen, and planters, applying the entrepreneurial skills they had learned during their years of legal predation to legitimate commercial activities. The democratic principles that had governed pirate crews continued to influence the development of maritime culture throughout the Atlantic world. Sailors who had served aboard pirate vessels carried with them the expectation of fair treatment and meaningful participation in decisions that affected their lives. These expectations gradually spread throughout the maritime community, contributing to the development of more egalitarian relationships between officers and crews on legitimate vessels. The economic innovations that had characterized pirate society also continued to influence commercial development throughout the region. The profit-sharing arrangements that had governed pirate crews provided models for later experiments in worker ownership and cooperative enterprise. The insurance and credit systems that had supported pirate operations were gradually incorporated into legitimate commercial networks, contributing to the expansion and sophistication of Atlantic trade. The intellectual legacy of the Pirate Republic proved to be even more enduring than its practical innovations. The success of Nassau's democratic institutions provided empirical evidence that challenged traditional justifications for hierarchical political systems. Enlightenment philosophers and political theorists drew on accounts of pirate democracy to support their arguments about the natural capacity of human beings for self-government. The influence of pirate democratic theory was particularly evident in the political developments that would transform the Atlantic world during the late 18th century. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the various independence movements that swept through Latin America all drew inspiration from traditions of resistance to imperial authority that included the legacy of Caribbean piracy. While this influence was rarely acknowledged explicitly, the democratic ideals that had characterized pirate society were clearly reflected in the revolutionary political theories of the period. The cultural transformation of pirate history during the decades following the Golden Age ensured that the legacy of Nassau's experiment would reach audiences far beyond the maritime communities where it had originated. The romanticized accounts of pirate adventures that filled popular literature and entertainment carried with them, however distorted, the essential message that ordinary people could challenge established authority and create alternative forms of social organization. The stories of individual pirates who had risen from humble origins to positions of wealth and influence became powerful symbols of social mobility and democratic possibility. The tales of captains like Samuel Bellamy, who had articulated sophisticated justifications for pirate activities, demonstrated that working people possessed the intellectual capacity for political leadership that elite theorists often denied. The accounts of figures like Bonny and Mary Read challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles while providing inspiration for later generations of women seeking expanded opportunities. The tactical and technological innovations that pirates had developed continued to influence naval warfare and maritime commerce for generations. The emphasis on speed, maneuverability, and psychological warfare that had characterized pirate operations was gradually incorporated into conventional naval doctrine. The modifications that pirates had made to their vessels influenced the development of ship design and construction techniques throughout the Atlantic world. The legal precedents that had been established during the suppression of Caribbean piracy also had lasting influence on the development of international law and maritime jurisprudence. The trials of pirate leaders had clarified important questions about jurisdiction, extradition, and the treatment of maritime criminals that would remain relevant for centuries. The legal frameworks that had been developed to deal with piracy would later be applied to other forms of irregular maritime activity. Perhaps most significantly, the memory of Nassau's pirate republic preserved the possibility that alternative forms of social organization could exist within the framework of the early modern Atlantic world. The fact that ordinary sailors had been able to create effective institutions of self-government, develop sophisticated systems of collective decision-making, and maintain relatively egalitarian communities for significant periods of time demonstrated that the hierarchical structures of imperial society were not inevitable or natural, but were instead artificial constructions that could be challenged and replaced. This possibility continued to inspire political movements and social experiments throughout the Atlantic world long after the pirate republic itself had been destroyed. The democratic ideals that had guided Nassau's development became part of the intellectual heritage that would influence the American Revolution, the abolition movement, the struggle for women's rights, and various other efforts to expand human freedom and equality. The transformation of the Caribbean during the decades following the Golden Age of Piracy also reflected broader changes in the imperial systems that governed the Atlantic world. The consolidation of European control over colonial territories, the development of more efficient administrative systems, and the growth of naval forces dedicated to protecting commercial shipping all contributed to a strategic environment that was increasingly hostile to irregular maritime activities. The economic changes that accompanied imperial consolidation also reduced the opportunities for profitable piracy while increasing the resources available for suppression efforts. The development of more secure and efficient systems of colonial commerce reduced the vulnerability of merchant shipping to pirate attack, while the growth of legitimate employment opportunities provided alternatives for skilled sailors who might otherwise have been attracted to piracy. The cultural legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy thus emerged during a period when the strategic and economic conditions that had made the pirate republic possible were rapidly disappearing. The romanticization of pirate history was facilitated by the removal of any real threat that pirates might pose to the existing order. The transformation of pirates from dangerous enemies into harmless romantic figures was an essential part of the process by which imperial societies dealt with the memory of successful resistance to their authority. Yet the influence of the pirate legacy extended far beyond the realm of popular entertainment and cultural mythology. The democratic innovations and humanitarian principles that had characterized the best aspects of pirate society continued to provide inspiration for those who sought to create more just and equitable forms of social organization. The success of pirate democratic institutions demonstrated that ordinary people possessed the capacity for self-government and collective action that elite theorists often denied. The story of Nassau's pirate republic had become part of the larger narrative of human struggle for freedom, equality, and self-determination that would shape the development of the modern world. The democratic ideals that had guided the pirate community would survive in various forms, inspiring later generations of reformers and revolutionaries, while also providing material for ongoing debates about the proper organization of human societies. The waves that lapped against the shores of Nassau in 1730 carried with them the salt of distant oceans and the memory of ships that had once sailed under the black flag in pursuit of democracy and treasure. The physical structures of the pirate republic had been dismantled, but the ideas and innovations that had made it so remarkable continued to flow through the intellectual currents of the Atlantic world like a tide that would return to reshape distant shores in ways that the imperial authorities could not foresee or control. The Golden Age of Piracy had ended, but its legacy lived on in the democratic traditions, cultural memories, and political aspirations that would continue to influence human societies for centuries to come. The republic of rogues that had flourished briefly in the warm waters of the Caribbean had demonstrated that another world was possible, one based on principles of equality, democracy, and human dignity that would eventually triumph over the hierarchical structures of the imperial age. The sun disappeared beneath the horizon, but the light it had cast on the waters of Nassau Harbor continued to shimmer in the gentle swells that carried the memory of the Golden Age toward distant shores, where new generations would discover the enduring power of the democratic dream that had been born in the Republic of Pirates.